It was the longest continuous battle of the Second World War, fought not on land but across the vast, unforgiving waters of the Atlantic Ocean. From the icy northern seas to the storm-lashed mid-Atlantic gap, this struggle determined the survival of nations. The Battle of the Atlantic was not a single clash, but a relentless war of attrition that stretched from the first shots of 1939 to the final months of 1945. For 6 long years, the ocean became a battlefield where every convoy mattered, every ship carried hope or despair, and every submarine lurked as a silent predator beneath the waves. The stakes could not have been higher. Britain, cut off from Europe, and dependent on supplies from across the sea, stood on the brink of starvation. Every ton of food, fuel, and weapons had to cross waters prowled by German U-boats, which turned the ocean into a graveyard of steel and men. The Germans, in turn, sought to strangle Britain's lifeline, believing that if the convoys could be broken, the island nation would collapse without invasion. What followed was a struggle as old as warfare itself, survival against blockade, fought now with modern machines and global stakes. Convoy after convoy braved the ocean, escorted by destroyers, corvettes, and aircraft that stretched their range to protect against unseen killers. Merchant sailors, often overlooked in the stories of war, became frontline warriors, steering their ships through storms, torpedoes, and fire. The German Wolfpacks, packs of submarines coordinated across hundreds of miles, struck with deadly precision, leaving flaming wreckage across the seas. For the Allies, every crossing was a gamble. For the Axis, every sinking was a step closer to victory. And yet, this was not only a battle of ships and submarines, but of technology and intelligence. Radar, sonar, depth charges, and code breaking turned the tide as the war dragged on. The breaking of the Enigma code at Bletchley Park became one of the most decisive victories in the shadows, allowing Allied escorts to anticipate Wolfpack movements and strike back. Aircraft carriers and long-range bombers filled the dreaded mid-Atlantic gap, leaving fewer safe havens for the hunters. Slowly, the hunted became the hunters, and the tide of the Atlantic shifted. But the cost was staggering. Thousands of ships were lost. Tens of thousands of sailors, merchant and naval alike, went to watery graves, their stories swallowed by the ocean. Survivors carried memories of burning oil slicks, freezing waters, and desperate fights for life in lifeboats drifting under endless skies. The Battle of the Atlantic was not just a naval conflict. It was a test of endurance, courage, and the will of nations to survive against relentless assault. This is the entire story of the Battle of the Atlantic, the convoys, the Wolfpacks, the technologies, and the human sacrifices that turned the tide of war. A story of sailors who braved the ocean, of submariners who stalked in silence, and of a struggle that decided the fate of Europe itself. So close your eyes, let the waves of history carry you, and drift into this journey across the Atlantic. And before we begin, share in the comments where you are tuning in from and what time it is there, because together, across oceans and time zones, we keep these stories alive. The Second World War was fought on many fronts, land, air, and sea. But nowhere was the struggle more prolonged and relentless than across the waters of the Atlantic Ocean. This vast expanse, stretching between the Americas and Europe, became the artery through which lifeblood flowed to the embattled British Isles, and later to the Allied forces pressing toward victory. Without the ships that carried food, weapons, fuel, and soldiers, Britain could not endure, nor could Europe be liberated. The Atlantic was more than just a stretch of water. It was a battlefield that determined the fate of nations. For Germany, strangling these routes meant starving Britain into submission before American industrial might could tip the scales. For the Allies, keeping the convoys alive was the difference between survival and collapse. This contest of endurance would become the longest continuous campaign of the war, stretching from the first shots in 1939 to the final surrender in 1945. At its heart was a duel between merchant ships and U-boats, between supply and starvation, between hope and despair. The Atlantic was no ordinary theatre of war. It was the lifeline upon which freedom itself depended. The importance of Atlantic supply routes cannot be overstated, for they carried more than just material goods. They carried the will to resist. Each convoy of merchant ships sailing from Halifax, New York, or Liverpool bore not only cargo but also the determination of Allied nations to continue the fight. Crates of ammunition and barrels of oil kept armies moving. Sacks of grain and frozen meat fed entire populations under siege. Britain, an island nation, was uniquely vulnerable, relying on imports for the majority of its food and raw materials. A single successful U-boat attack could send thousands of tons of cargo to the ocean floor, depriving civilians and soldiers alike of essentials. The convoys represented lifelines in the truest sense, strands that tied together continents and peoples across treacherous waters. Protecting them became the Royal Navy's highest priority, for to lose control of the Atlantic would mean isolation, starvation, and defeat. It was not glamorous warfare, but it was essential, fought in storm and shadow as much as in fire and fury. The convoys symbolized both fragility and resilience, fragile against the Wolfpacks, yet resilient in their unyielding necessity. The Royal Navy stood as the first and most important guardian of these vital routes. Emerging from the First World War as the largest naval power in the world, Britain had long understood the centrality of sea lanes to its security. Yet in 1939, the Royal Navy faced a daunting challenge to escort merchant fleets across an ocean too vast to guard completely, while countering a German navy that had embraced submarine warfare as its sharpest weapon. Alongside the Royal Navy sailed the Merchant Navy, civilian sailors who bore the brunt of danger with courage and persistence. These men, often overlooked, faced storms, isolation, and sudden death with no weapon but endurance. Their contribution was as critical as that of soldiers on the battlefield, for without their willingness to sail, no supplies would reach the front. Together, the Royal and Merchant Navies formed a partnership of protection and sacrifice, one armed and one unarmed, both essential. Each voyage was a gamble, every crossing a test of will against an enemy lurking beneath the waves. Their collaboration became the backbone of Allied survival, a testament to the shared burden of war. Germany's U-boat threat cast a long and menacing shadow over this lifeline, for the Kriegsmarine knew it could never match the Royal Navy ship for ship. Instead, Admiral Karl Dönitz championed the submarine as the weapon that could level the balance of power. Sleek, stealthy, and deadly, the U-boats prowled the shipping lanes like wolves, striking without warning and vanishing into the depths. Their strategy was clear: to sink merchant tonnage faster than the Allies could replace it, starving Britain of resources and morale. In the early years of the war, U-boat captains became infamous figures, celebrated in Germany for their deadly efficiency. Entire convoys vanished beneath the waves, swallowed by coordinated Wolfpack attacks that left survivors adrift in lifeboats, watching the flames of burning oil slicks light the night sky. The U-boat menace was not just military, it was psychological, spreading fear among sailors and threatening to break the backbone of Allied logistics. For every convoy that reached port, another was lost, and each loss tightened the noose around Britain's survival. The Battle of the Atlantic was in essence a war of attrition waged beneath the waves. The scale of the Atlantic campaign was unparalleled, spanning millions of square miles and lasting the entire duration of the war. Unlike battles fought on land with clear fronts, the Battle of the Atlantic was everywhere and nowhere, fought in scattered encounters across an unforgiving ocean. Storms battered ships as fiercely as enemy attacks, while the endless horizon offered no refuge. Sailors endured weeks at sea, haunted by the knowledge that danger could rise from the depths at any moment. Convoys stretched in long columns, a moving target vulnerable to surprise, while escorts darted back and forth, scanning with sonar and straining to protect their charges. The rhythm of this conflict was one of constant vigilance, nights of tense silence broken by explosions, days of monotony shattered by sudden violence. The campaign demanded endurance not only from ships and weapons, but from the men who fought, sailed, and suffered. It was a battle fought not for territory, but for survival, measured in tonnage delivered or destroyed. In its scope and duration, it was unlike any other struggle of the Second World War. What made the Battle of the Atlantic unique was that it touched every aspect of the war, military, economic, and civilian alike. For Britain, it determined whether factories could produce, whether soldiers could be supplied, whether civilians could eat. For Germany, it was the only way to choke off Britain's resistance before the United States fully entered the conflict. For the United States, once engaged, it became the bridge that enabled the arsenal of democracy to reach European shores. Civilians felt its effects in rationing, shortages, and the ever-present fear of seeing loved ones lost at sea. Leaders like Winston Churchill openly admitted that the U-boat campaign was the threat that most kept them awake at night. Every strategy in Europe, from D-Day to the Soviet offensives, depended upon keeping the Atlantic lifeline open. The campaign's importance lay not in grand offensives or spectacular battles, but in its ceaseless grind, its invisible yet indispensable role in sustaining the Allied war effort. Without victory in the Atlantic, no victory anywhere else would have been possible. It was the campaign upon which the outcome of the war balanced. As the longest and most critical campaign of the war, the Battle of the Atlantic set the stage for a story of endurance, innovation, and sacrifice. It would see new technologies emerge, from sonar to code breaking, and new tactics evolve as both sides sought advantage in the unforgiving ocean. It would involve men from every corner of the globe, British, Canadian, American, Norwegian, Polish, Dutch, and countless others, each risking everything to keep the sea lanes open. It would witness immense loss, with thousands of merchant sailors, naval officers, and U-boat crews perishing in the cold Atlantic depths. Yet it would also demonstrate resilience, as the Allies gradually learned, adapted, and turned the tide. This is the story of ships that carried nations' hopes, of submarines that hunted in silence, and of sailors whose courage underpinned the very survival of freedom. The Battle of the Atlantic was not fought for glory, but for necessity, not for conquest, but for endurance. And in its outcome lay the fate of the Second World War itself. The stage is set, and the lifeline stretches across the sea, ready for the struggle that will define it. The story of the Battle of the Atlantic did not begin with the outbreak of war in September 1939. It was rooted in the interwar years, when nations sought to rebuild, restrain, and redefine their navies after the devastation of World War I. The Treaty of Versailles, imposed upon Germany in 1919, drastically limited the size and composition of its fleet, forbidding the construction of submarines and restricting battleship tonnage. Britain, weary from its colossal wartime expenditure, sought to maintain naval supremacy, but with fewer resources, relying on treaties to keep rivals in check. The Washington Naval Treaty of 1922 and subsequent London naval treaties attempted to set ratios for capital ships, hoping to prevent another arms race at sea. These agreements enshrined the Royal Navy as still dominant, but acknowledged the rising influence of both the United States and Japan. For Germany, the restrictions became both humiliation and motivation, pushing naval planners to think creatively within limits. As the 1930s progressed, these treaties frayed under the weight of ambition and ideology. Adolf Hitler's rise to power in 1933 signaled the end of restraint, as Germany openly defied limitations. The seeds of the Atlantic struggle were sown long before the first torpedo was fired. In Britain, the interwar years were marked by a difficult balance between economic austerity and the need to maintain naval supremacy. The Royal Navy, stretched across global commitments from the Mediterranean to the Far East, faced challenges in modernizing its fleet. Aging battleships remained in service, while resources for new destroyers, cruisers, and escort vessels were often inadequate. Politicians debated the value of maintaining an expansive navy at a time when the British Empire seemed secure, underestimating the threat of renewed German aggression. Submarines, though recognized as dangerous, were seen primarily in the context of defending trade routes, not as offensive weapons. Yet naval thinkers such as Admiral Sir Dudley Pound and Admiral Sir Ernest Chatfield began to emphasize the convoy system, reflecting lessons from the First World War, when U-boats had nearly starved Britain into submission. Still, funding was limited, and Britain entered the late 1930s with too few escorts to protect its merchant fleet. This strategic shortfall would soon prove costly when Germany unleashed its submarine campaign. Britain's reliance on treaties and diplomacy, rather than rapid naval expansion, left its lifelines vulnerable as war loomed. For Germany, the naval situation was shaped by frustration and ambition. The Versailles Treaty's restrictions had left the Reichsmarine a shadow of its former self, but in secret, German naval officers studied ways to bypass these limitations. With Hitler's rise, their ambitions found political backing. In 1935, Germany signed the Anglo-German Naval Agreement, which allowed it to build a fleet up to 35% the size of the Royal Navy's. This agreement, intended by Britain to appease Hitler, instead legitimized German rearmament and encouraged Admiral Erich Raeder's ambitious Plan Z. The plan envisioned a powerful fleet of battleships, aircraft carriers, cruisers, and hundreds of submarines, capable of challenging Britain on the high seas by the mid-1940s. Yet time was not on Germany's side. War came before these dreams could be realized. As a result, Germany entered the conflict with only a handful of capital ships, but a growing submarine arm under Admiral Karl Dönitz. Raeder's vision of surface battles became irrelevant as the U-boat emerged as Germany's true weapon of disruption. Strategy and necessity converged to make the submarine the spearhead of German naval warfare. The submarine's role in interwar planning became a point of sharp divergence between British and German approaches. Britain, still haunted by the devastation of unrestricted U-boat warfare in 1917, supported international bans on submarine use against commerce. These agreements, however, were little more than words on paper. Germany, under Dönitz's leadership, studied the lessons of World War I carefully, recognizing the submarine as the weapon that had come closest to defeating Britain. Dönitz developed the concept of Rudeltaktik, or Wolfpack tactics, envisioning coordinated groups of U-boats overwhelming convoys under cover of darkness. While resources limited his ability to build large numbers before 1939, he trained crews rigorously, emphasizing stealth, patience, and aggressive strikes. By the outbreak of war, he commanded fewer than 60 operational U-boats, far short of the 300 he believed necessary to win. Yet these submarines represented a lethal nucleus, ready to exploit Britain's unpreparedness. In contrast, The Royal Navy still clung to the primacy of battleships and cruisers, underestimating how deadly the undersea threat could become. This asymmetry of vision would define the early years of the Atlantic conflict. Strategic expectations before 1939 reflected the broader ambitions and anxieties of each nation. Germany viewed the Atlantic as Britain's Achilles heel, the artery that must be cut to force surrender. Hitler himself, though primarily focused on land campaigns, understood the importance of strangling Britain's supply routes. Yet he underestimated the time and resources required to build a fleet capable of decisive action. The Kriegsmarine's reliance on U-boats was thus both a necessity and an opportunity, shaping a campaign of attrition rather than direct confrontation. Britain, by contrast, anticipated a reprise of World War I's Commerce War, but believed its convoy system and naval superiority would hold firm. Few expected the scale of devastation that early U-boat campaigns would inflict. The United States, still officially neutral, maintained a watchful eye, but assumed its naval strength and geography offered security. As tensions mounted, the Atlantic became a chessboard, upon which strategy, technology, and ideology would collide. Each side entered the war with expectations rooted in history, but destined to be tested by the brutal reality of modern warfare. Technology played a crucial role in shaping pre-war naval strategy, as both sides sought to harness innovation for advantage. For Britain, advances in sonar, known then as ADSIC, promised to make submarines less of a threat by detecting them underwater. Confidence in this new technology bred a sense of complacency, leading some to believe the U-boat menace could be easily contained. Germany, meanwhile, invested heavily in refining torpedoes, building stealthier U-boats, and training crews in cutting-edge tactics. The early Type 7 submarines, compact yet powerful, became the backbone of the fleet, capable of striking across the Atlantic. Radar, still in its infancy, held promise for detecting surface raiders and aircraft, but its full potential had yet to be realized. Both nations entered the war with technologies that seemed revolutionary, but were still limited by inexperience and shortages. The Battle of the Atlantic would in many ways become a proving ground for these innovations, as radar, sonar, and code breaking evolved into decisive tools. The interwar period was thus not only about treaties and strategies, but also about preparing for a technological duel across the seas. By the eve of war in 1939, the stage was set for a struggle that neither side fully anticipated. Britain relied on its historic naval supremacy and the convoy system, but lacked the escorts and coordination to make them effective immediately. Germany, constrained by time and resources, pinned its hopes on submarines, envisioning them as wolves circling Britain's vital lifelines. Both sides underestimated the sheer scale and brutality the Atlantic campaign would reach. The Royal Navy entered the war stretched thin, while the Merchant Navy faced peril without adequate protection. The Kriegsmarine launched its submarines into the Atlantic with confidence, but not in sufficient numbers to guarantee swift victory. Expectations on both sides were soon shattered, as the ocean became a battlefield unlike any other. The interwar years, filled with treaties, plans, and cautious calculations, had laid the groundwork, but failed to prepare nations for the relentless reality ahead. What followed would be a test not just of ships and weapons, but of endurance, innovation, and the will to survive. The Battle of the Atlantic was ready to begin, and its roots stretched deep into the fragile peace of the 1920s and 1930s. When war erupted in September 1939, the Atlantic was immediately transformed into a battlefield, its vast waters filled with tension and uncertainty. Germany wasted no time in unleashing its U-boats, sending them to patrol the shipping lanes that sustained Britain. These submarines slipped into the North Sea and beyond, their crews eager to prove themselves in a campaign that promised decisive results. On September 3rd, the very day Britain declared war, U-30 torpedoed the passenger liner Athenia, killing more than 100 civilians, including women and children. Though the German High Command initially tried to deny responsibility, the sinking sent shockwaves across the world, foreshadowing the brutal nature of the struggle to come. U-boats began prowling the western approaches to Britain, targeting unescorted merchant ships with ruthless efficiency. Sailors who had once thought the Atlantic a place of commerce now found themselves in a theater of death. The sudden escalation of attacks revealed just how vulnerable Britain's supply routes were at the war's outset. In these first days, the tone of the longest naval campaign was set relentless, merciless, and vital to the outcome of the war. Surface raiders also played a significant role in the opening phase of the conflict, adding another dimension to Germany's maritime threat. The Kriegsmarine deployed pocket battleships, such as the Graf Spee and Deutschland, sleek warships designed to outrun stronger foes while preying on merchant traffic. These vessels prowled the shipping lanes of the South Atlantic and Indian Ocean, striking suddenly and disappearing into the vastness of the seas. Their presence forced the Royal Navy to spread its resources thin, dispatching hunting groups of cruisers and battleships to track them down. The Battle of the River Plate in December 1939, where the Graf Spee was cornered and scuttled off Montevideo, marked one of the earliest dramatic encounters at sea. While the British celebrated a victory, the episode underscored how even a handful of German surface raiders could disrupt global trade. Merchant ships, already terrified of submarines, now feared swift death at the hands of powerful gunships. The oceans, once highways of commerce, had become hunting grounds where predators lurked unseen. For Britain, the threat was not just beneath the waves but on the horizon as well. Early U-boat patrols demonstrated the deadly effectiveness of Germany's undersea strategy. Operating in small numbers, they nonetheless struck hard against merchant vessels, taking advantage of Britain's unprepared defences. By the end of 1939, dozens of ships had already been sunk, sending hundreds of thousands of tons of vital cargo to the seabed. U-boat commanders like Günther Prien quickly rose to fame, celebrated in Germany as naval heroes. Prien's daring attack on Scapa Flow in October 1939, where he penetrated the Royal Navy's main anchorage and sank the battleship Royal Oak, electrified the German public and embarrassed the British Admiralty. The incident revealed the vulnerability of even the mightiest fleet when confronted with stealth and audacity. For British sailors, the myth of naval invulnerability shattered overnight, replaced by an urgent awareness of the growing submarine menace. Each sinking carried a human cost, as sailors braved icy waters and lifeboats while waiting for rescue. The early patrols marked the beginning of a deadly rhythm: departure, attack, destruction, and return, that would continue unbroken for 6 years. The undersea war had begun, and it would shape every decision made at sea. Britain responded by reactivating the Convoy System, a defensive measure that had proven essential during the First World War. Convoys grouped merchant ships together, escorted by destroyers and corvettes, tasked with warding off submarine attacks. In theory, the system offered strength in numbers, forcing U-boats to risk exposure by attacking defended formations. In practice, however, early convoys were plagued by shortages of escorts and coordination challenges. Many merchant captains were initially reluctant to sail in convoy, believing that sailing alone offered a better chance of avoiding detection. The Admiralty, still adjusting to the scale of the U-boat threat, struggled to assign sufficient warships to cover every convoy route. As a result, losses mounted, and the Royal Navy was forced to stretch its resources thin across the North Atlantic, Mediterranean, and Far East. The convoy system was effective when fully supported, but in 1939 it was still a fragile shield against an aggressive and determined enemy. These first efforts laid the foundation for later success, but also highlighted the steep learning curve that lay ahead. The struggle to protect convoys would become the defining feature of the Atlantic campaign. The human impact of these early months of naval war was immense, extending far beyond the crews of warships and submarines. Civilian merchant sailors found themselves on the front lines of a war they had not volunteered to fight. Their ships, often unarmed or lightly armed, became prime targets for U-boats and surface raiders. When torpedoes struck, explosions tore through steel hulls, scattering cargo and men into frigid waters. Survivors clung to lifeboats or rafts, facing hours or days of exposure before rescue, if rescue came at all. Families at home anxiously awaited news, reading casualty lists in newspapers and fearing the telegram that might never arrive. The loss of food shipments meant rationing for civilians across Britain, who felt the battle's effects in empty shelves and strict quotas. For the Germans too, U-boat crews endured harsh conditions, crammed into steel tubes for weeks at a time, risking death with every patrol. The Battle of the Atlantic was not abstract strategy. It was lived daily by thousands of ordinary men and women, caught in a conflict that reached into every home. Even as losses mounted, there was little recognition at first that the Atlantic campaign would become the longest and most decisive struggle of the war. For Germany, early successes fed the illusion that Britain might be brought to its knees quickly through maritime pressure. For Britain, each sinking was a grim reminder of how precarious its survival truly was. Yet many still underestimated the scale of the challenge ahead. The Admiralty believed that its technological edge, including sonar, ASDIC, would soon contain the U-boat Menace. Civilians, while shocked by stories of torpedoed liners, took comfort in the Royal Navy's reputation for strength. The sinking of the Athenia and the Royal Oak were seen as outrages but not yet as harbingers of an enduring struggle. Few realized in 1939 that the Atlantic would become a battlefield where the war's outcome would be decided over 6 relentless years. This early phase was only the opening act, foreshadowing the scale and intensity yet to come. In hindsight, the war at sea was not a sideshow, but the lifeline upon which everything else depended. Its true weight had yet to be fully felt. By the close of 1939, the outlines of the Battle of the Atlantic were already taking shape. U-boats striking at will, surface raiders spreading fear, convoys struggling to adapt, and civilians paying the price. The conflict at sea was still in its infancy, but its stakes were clear. Britain's survival depended on the ability to keep its supply routes open, while Germany's hopes for victory rested on choking them off. The first months revealed the strengths and weaknesses of both sides, the daring of U-boat commanders, the resilience of the Royal Navy, the bravery of merchant sailors, and the vulnerability of an island nation under siege. What had begun with isolated attacks would soon escalate into a full-scale struggle of endurance and innovation. The Atlantic was no longer a highway of trade. It was a battlefield where every ship carried the weight of nations. The longest campaign of the Second World War had begun, and it would test not only fleets, but the will of entire peoples. The ocean, vast and unforgiving, had become the front line of a global conflict. As the first months of the war unfolded, Germany's U-boats began to prove themselves as the sharpest edge of Hitler's naval arsenal. Small in number but devastating in effect, these sleek predators of the deep stalked the shipping lanes with growing confidence. Commanded by daring captains, they struck at unescorted merchant ships with precision, their torpedoes leaving trails of destruction across the Atlantic. The early phase of the campaign revealed the Royal Navy's unpreparedness, as escorts were spread thin and convoys had not yet reached their full defensive potential. German propaganda celebrated each sinking, turning U-boat aces into national heroes, symbols of defiance against Britain's centuries-old naval dominance. For sailors crossing the Atlantic, the Menace was constant and unseen, a lurking shadow beneath the waves. Each ship that vanished into the depths was more than steel and cargo. It represented food shortages, fuel crises, and mounting civilian hardship back in Britain. The Menace was not only military but psychological, shaking confidence in the Royal Navy's ability to shield its lifeline. It was clear that a new kind of war had begun, one that blurred the lines between combat zones and civilian survival. The U-boats had seized the initiative, and their menace grew with every passing month. At the heart of Germany's submarine strategy was Admiral Karl Dönitz, a former U-boat commander from the First World War, who believed passionately in the power of the undersea fleet. Unlike his superior, Admiral Raeder, who favored grand surface ships, Dönitz saw submarines as the true equalizer against Britain's superior navy. He developed the concept of the Wolfpack, a method of concentrating U-boats against convoys to overwhelm their escorts and ensure devastating losses. The tactic relied on radio communication and coordination. Once a convoy was sighted, the U-boat shadowing it would call in reinforcements, turning a lone hunter into a pack of predators. Dönitz envisioned a fleet of hundreds of U-boats prowling the Atlantic simultaneously, strangling Britain into submission. In 1939, however, he had barely 60 operational boats, far short of his desired 300. Yet even with limited numbers, his vision began to show its power. Convoys faced nights of relentless assault, with multiple submarines attacking in waves under the cover of darkness. For Dönitz, each sinking was not just a tactical victory, but proof that his strategy could bring Britain to its knees. The Wolfpack was born, and the Atlantic would never be the same. The Wolfpack tactic capitalized on the vulnerabilities of early Allied defenses. Escort ships, often just a handful of destroyers or corvettes, struggled to protect convoys stretching across miles of ocean. Radar and sonar technology was still primitive, often failing to detect submarines until torpedoes were already on their way. The U-boats, by contrast, could approach silently beneath the waves, surfacing at night to strike from unexpected angles. Their low profiles and small sizes made them difficult to spot even in daylight, while at night they blended into the darkness. Coordinated attacks created chaos, as escorts raced from one end of the convoy to the other, unable to cover every angle at once. Merchant sailors, armed with little more than courage and perhaps a single deck gun, stood virtually helpless against coordinated strikes. Survivors often recalled the terror of explosions in the dark, of ships breaking apart, and of comrades cast into icy seas. For the Allies, each night crossing became a trial of endurance against unseen hunters. The Wolfpacks proved that Germany had discovered a weapon capable of striking at the heart of Britain's survival. The Menace had matured into a systematic strategy of destruction. The successes of early U-boats were staggering, measured not only in tonnage sunk, but in the morale they eroded. In 1940 alone, hundreds of ships were lost, sending millions of tons of cargo to the ocean floor. Entire convoys were decimated in single nights, their wreckage left burning across the waves. German submariners reveled in their victories, celebrated as knights of the sea by Nazi propaganda. Commanders such as Günther Prien, Otto Kretschmer, and Joachim Schepke became household names. Their exploits published in newspapers and broadcast on radio as proof of German naval superiority. Kretschmer, known as Silent Otto, perfected the art of stealth attacks, becoming the most successful U-boat commander of the war. These men were not just military leaders, but symbols of national pride, embodying the daring and ruthlessness admired by the regime. Their fame elevated the U-boat arm to a position of prominence within the Kriegsmarine, overshadowing even the surface fleet. Each success emboldened Germany, strengthening belief that the Atlantic could indeed be turned into Britain's graveyard. The myth of invincible U-boat commanders added to the menace, deepening the psychological toll on their enemies. British countermeasures, though earnest, struggled to keep pace with the growing U-boat menace. The Royal Navy expanded the convoy system, but shortages of escorts left many ships exposed on long voyages. Sonar, while promising, often failed to detect submarines hiding beneath thermal layers or exploiting the ocean's natural noise. Depth charges, the primary weapon against submarines, required accurate positioning and were often dropped blindly into the vast sea. Aircraft, capable of spotting U-boats from the air, had limited range and left a deadly gap in the mid-Atlantic where convoys sailed without cover. The Admiralty worked feverishly to develop new tactics, but losses continued to mount faster than solutions could be implemented. Britain appealed to its allies, particularly Canada, to provide additional escort ships, creating an international partnership for survival. Yet in these early years, technology and coordination lagged behind the ruthlessness of the U-boats. For every submarine destroyed, several more ships were lost, and the balance tipped ever more in Germany's favor. The countermeasures were a shield riddled with holes, while the U-boats grew ever bolder. The menace thrived, feeding on Allied weakness and hesitation. The menace was not limited to statistics of tonnage sunk. It reverberated deeply into the lives of civilians. Each lost ship meant not only dead sailors but also rationing at home, shortages of fuel, and disrupted industry. Families across Britain scanned newspapers for news of convoys, dreading the lists of ships reported missing. Civilians felt the strain of reduced food supplies, with ration books becoming a daily reminder of the U-boat campaign. The psychological impact was profound: fear of starvation, uncertainty about the future, and growing doubts about whether Britain could endure. Churchill himself admitted that the U-boat threat was the only thing that truly frightened him, acknowledging its power to undo Britain's resistance. The menace reached beyond the battlefield, seeping into kitchens, factories, and classrooms. Every loaf of bread, every tank of fuel, carried the hidden weight of the battle raging across the Atlantic. The U-boat campaign was not just about ships, it was about the survival of a nation under siege. Its menace was total, touching soldier and civilian alike. The Atlantic War had become a struggle for the very heartbeat of Britain. By the end of 1940, the menace of the U-boats was undeniable, and the Battle of the Atlantic had entered a new and perilous phase. The Wolfpacks had proven their power, inflicting losses that threatened to bring Britain to its knees. German commanders exuded confidence, convinced that victory at sea was within reach. Britain, though blooded, refused to surrender, pouring resources into escort ships, air patrols, and new technologies. The stage was set for a prolonged duel, one in which innovation and endurance would decide the outcome. The menace of the U-boats was not a passing storm, but a constant threat that would dominate Allied strategy for years to come. As convoys sailed under the watchful eyes of escorts, every sailor knew that beneath the waves lurked enemies ready to strike. The early successes of the U-boats ensured that the Battle of the Atlantic would not be won quickly or easily. It would be a campaign of shadows and endurance, fought across endless miles of ocean. The menace had begun, and it would take everything the Allies had to overcome it. The Convoy System, resurrected from its critical role in the First World War, became the backbone of Britain's defense against the U-boat menace. Its concept was simple, yet profound: merchant ships, instead of sailing alone across the vast Atlantic, would group together in large formations under the protection of naval escorts. This system transformed vulnerable individual vessels into a collective shield, reducing the chances of U-boats picking them off one by one. Convoys could stretch for miles, with columns of freighters and tankers steaming in disciplined lines through hostile waters. Each convoy was assigned a code, such as HX for Halifax to Britain, or SC for slow convoys, their names becoming part of the lexicon of survival. For sailors, joining a convoy meant relinquishing independence for safety, entrusting their fate to escorts and coordination. The strategy relied not only on numbers but on cooperation, demanding meticulous organization from departure to arrival. Yet it also introduced new vulnerabilities, for a convoy was a massive target visible to Wolfpacks prowling the ocean. The system embodied the central tension of the Atlantic War: safety in numbers against danger in concentration. The escorts formed the shield around these convoys, braving the same dangers but armed to protect. Destroyers, fast and agile, were the first line of defense, dashing ahead to detect submarines with sonar or racing to drop depth charges at fleeting contacts. Smaller corvettes, often converted from civilian designs, became the unsung workhorses of the Atlantic. Slow but resilient, they guarded the flanks and rear, their crews enduring long patrols in cramped and storm-battered conditions. The Royal Navy, short of modern warships, turned to shipyards across Britain and Canada to mass-produce these escorts, each one a lifeline to countless merchantmen. Escort groups were formed, combining destroyers, corvettes, and sloops into coordinated teams trained to protect convoys with discipline and aggression. These groups learned to operate like packs themselves, countering Wolfpacks with coordinated maneuvers and relentless pursuit. Every escort ship represented a fragile line between safety and catastrophe, their guns and depth charges the only weapons against unseen enemies. Escort sailors bore enormous responsibility, knowing that one missed detection could doom dozens of ships. In their courage and endurance lay the hope of keeping Britain supplied. The organization of convoys was a logistical challenge of staggering proportions, requiring coordination across oceans and nations. Ships of varying speeds and capabilities had to be grouped together, often meaning faster vessels were slowed to match the weakest. Convoys were organized at key ports such as Halifax, New York, and Liverpool, where naval officers meticulously plotted routes to avoid known U-boat patrol lines. Communication was crucial, yet it had to remain discreet to prevent interception by German intelligence. Each convoy had a commodore, usually a seasoned merchant captain, who coordinated the movements of the civilian ships, while the escorts handled defense. Convoy sailing demanded discipline. Ships had to maintain formation regardless of weather, trusting that order would mean survival. Storms could scatter ships, fog could obscure signals, and confusion could leave stragglers easy prey for U-boats. Convoys became floating communities, with dozens of ships united by shared vulnerability and shared purpose. For sailors, joining a convoy was both a comfort and a strain, offering safety but also the tension of knowing they were prime targets. The system required coordination on a scale rarely seen in naval history. Despite its promise, the convoy system faced serious coordination challenges in its early years. Britain lacked enough escorts to cover every convoy, forcing some ships to sail unprotected across perilous waters. Convoys often had to wait in port until escorts became available, delaying the delivery of desperately needed supplies. Escort groups, stretched thin, sometimes had to abandon convoys mid-journey to refuel or redeploy, leaving merchantmen vulnerable in the mid-Atlantic gap where no air cover reached. Inexperience also plagued the system, as escorts struggled to communicate effectively and merchant ships struggled to maintain formation under stress. A single mistake, a ship veering out of line, a signal misunderstood, could unravel the convoy's cohesion, exposing it to attack. U-boats exploited these weaknesses, shadowing convoys for days and calling in reinforcements before striking en masse. Early battles revealed the fragility of the system when poorly executed, with entire convoys decimated in night attacks. The Royal Navy recognized that convoys were not foolproof, but the only realistic defense. Their survival depended on constant refinement, better training, and more resources. The convoy system was both shield and strain, a necessity that demanded perfection under impossible conditions. Effectiveness came slowly, forged through trial, error, and sacrifice. As escort groups gained experience, their tactics improved, shifting from passive defense to aggressive counterattack. Corvettes and destroyers began to hunt U-boats relentlessly, using sonar to track them and depth charges to force them to the surface. Convoy commanders learned to anticipate Wolfpack tactics, altering routes or zigzagging to frustrate torpedo solutions. Coordination between ships improved through standardized signals and drills, building cohesion across diverse fleets. Over time, convoys began to repel attacks more effectively, reducing losses even as the U-boat threat grew. Success was never guaranteed, but survival rates improved significantly when convoys were well escorted. Merchant sailors gained faith in the system, recognizing that their chances of reaching port were far higher in convoy than alone. The system also forced U-boats into riskier, more concentrated attacks, increasing their exposure to countermeasures. By 1941, the convoy system had proven itself indispensable, though far from invulnerable. Its effectiveness grew in tandem with the courage and endurance of the men who maintained it under constant threat. Life within a convoy was a unique experience, marked by monotony punctuated by terror. Merchant sailors spent days scanning the horizon, knowing that beneath the waves lurked unseen enemies. The sight of escorts patrolling nearby offered comfort, but it was a fragile reassurance, shattered by the sudden roar of torpedoes. When attacks came, the convoy's order erupted into chaos, as ships veered wildly, escorts charged, and explosions lit the night. Survivors described the eerie silence that followed, broken only by cries from the water and the groans of sinking ships. Rescues were attempted whenever possible, but often there was no time, as escorts pursued submarines and convoys steamed onward. Each journey tested endurance, faith, and resolve, as sailors wrestled with fear and fatigue. For many, convoy duty became a crucible of resilience, binding men together in bonds forged by survival. Every successful arrival was a victory not just of strategy, but of human spirit. The convoy system was more than a tactic. It was a lifeline of shared sacrifice. By the midpoint of the war, the convoy system stood as the cornerstone of Allied survival, embodying the resilience that would ultimately win the Battle of the Atlantic. It was far from perfect, plagued by shortages, coordination struggles, and constant danger. Yet it worked, reducing losses and ensuring that Britain remained supplied through its darkest hours. The escorts that guarded convoys became symbols of endurance, small ships that carried the weight of nations on their decks. The convoys themselves, stretching across the ocean in defiance of Wolfpacks, demonstrated the power of collective strength against predatory isolation. Each voyage was a reminder that survival depended not on individual ships, but on unity, organization, and courage. For Germany, the convoy system presented a challenge that even the most skilled U-boat commanders could not always overcome. For Britain and its allies, it represented both vulnerability and hope, a fragile yet vital shield against defeat. In its discipline and endurance, the convoy system reflected the very character of the war at sea: relentless, exhausting, and essential. It was not glamorous, but it was decisive. The battle for survival was fought in formation across the endless waves of the Atlantic. While Germany's U-boats prowled silently beneath the waves, another threat stalked the oceans in plain sight: the surface raiders designed to prey on merchant shipping with speed and firepower. Chief among these were the so-called pocket battleships, products of Germany's interwar naval ingenuity and treaty constraints. Vessels like the Admiral Graf Spee, the Deutschland, and the Admiral Scheer were smaller than traditional battleships, but carried heavy guns and long cruising ranges. They were fast enough to outrun larger warships, yet powerful enough to destroy convoys or lone freighters with ease. Their mission was clear: to terrorize the Atlantic and Indian Oceans, striking far from Europe to scatter Allied resources across the globe. For Britain, which depended on sea lanes stretching across continents, even a single raider posed an outsized threat. The pocket battleships became symbols of German cunning, embodying a strategy that sought disruption rather than domination. They forced the Royal Navy to stretch its strength thinly, diverting capital ships to far-flung hunts. In this way, they amplified the impact of Germany's limited naval assets. Their menace was as psychological as it was material, turning vast oceans into hunting grounds for predators in steel. The Admiral Graf Spee became the most infamous of these raiders, her journey in 1939 capturing the world's attention. Slipping into the South Atlantic shortly before war broke out, she began a calculated campaign against merchant shipping. Her captain, Hans Langsdorff, was a seasoned officer who combined efficiency with an unusual degree of humanity, often allowing crews to abandon ship before sinking their vessels. Between September and December, the Graf Spee sank or captured 9 merchant ships, totaling over 50,000 tons of shipping. Each loss echoed across Allied supply lines, threatening Britain's lifeline while boosting German morale. The Royal Navy, humiliated by the audacity of a single ship roaming freely, organized massive hunting groups involving battleships, cruisers, and aircraft carriers scouring the oceans. Yet Langsdorff skillfully evaded capture, demonstrating the difficulty of tracking a fast and elusive raider across vast waters. His ship became a phantom presence, feared by merchant sailors who never knew when or where she might appear. The campaign of the Graf Spee was a masterclass in commerce raiding, amplifying German naval strategy far beyond the size of its fleet. The campaign reached its climax in December 1939 at the Battle of the River Plate, off the coast of Uruguay. 3 British cruisers, HMS Exeter, HMS Ajax, and HMS Achilles, intercepted the Graf Spee after an extensive pursuit. Despite being outgunned, the British captains pressed their attack with aggression and determination, sustaining heavy damage in the process. The Exeter was severely battered, her decks torn apart by heavy shells, yet she remained afloat. The Ajax and Achilles, though lighter, darted in and out, harassing the German raider with relentless fire. Langsdorff fought skillfully, inflicting serious casualties, but he could not deliver a decisive blow. Running low on ammunition and damaged himself, he sought refuge in the neutral port of Montevideo. International law limited his stay, while British diplomacy and misinformation convinced him that overwhelming reinforcements awaited outside the harbour. Facing what he believed was certain destruction, Langsdorff made a fateful decision. On December 17th, the Graf Spee was scuttled by her own crew, ending her voyage in flames as thousands of Uruguayans watched from the shore. The battle became one of the earliest turning points at sea, a dramatic contest of endurance and deception. The scuttling of the Graf Spee carried immense symbolic weight both for Germany and for Britain. For the Germans, the loss was a humiliation, a reminder of the limitations of their surface fleet. Propaganda had celebrated the raiders' successes, but her destruction exposed the fragility of Germany's commerce raiding strategy when confronted with determined resistance. For the British, the outcome was a badly needed victory in the war's opening months, boosting morale at home and reassuring civilians that the Royal Navy could still deliver. The drama in Montevideo, broadcast by international press, captured global attention, turning a naval clash into a political spectacle. Captain Langsdorff, respected even by his adversaries, took his own life days later, wrapped in the naval ensign of the Graf Spee. His death underscored the tragedy of a campaign, fought with professionalism, but consumed by larger forces of war. The episode became a reminder that commerce raiding could deliver temporary disruption, but rarely lasting impact against a determined opponent. The Atlantic had revealed itself as unforgiving, where even the boldest surface raider could meet a swift end. The lessons would resonate throughout the Kriegsmarine's future operations. Strategically, the Battle of the River Plate highlighted the difficulties inherent in Germany's surface raider doctrine. While pocket battleships could inflict damage on scattered merchant traffic, they could not withstand prolonged encounters with concentrated enemy forces. Each sortie carried enormous risk, for the oceans, though vast, were not limitless, and the Royal Navy's reach remained global. Every raider required extensive logistics, including supply ships known as tenders, to fuel and provision their long cruises. Once discovered, their freedom of maneuver rapidly narrowed, forcing them into either retreat or confrontation. The Graf Spee's demise demonstrated that commerce raiding, while disruptive, could not achieve decisive results on its own. For Germany, this reality underscored the importance of the U-boat fleet, which could operate with stealth and persistence unmatched by surface ships. For Britain, the battle confirmed the value of persistence, coordination, and global communication in neutralizing even the most elusive foes. The strategic lesson was clear: surface raiders could sting, but they could not strangle Britain. The focus of the Atlantic War would shift ever more decisively beneath the waves. Yet, the threat of surface raiders did not vanish with the Graf Spee. Other German warships, including the Admiral Scheer and the battlecruisers Scharnhorst and Gneisenau, would later attempt their own campaigns of disruption. These ships demonstrated the continued potential for havoc, sinking dozens of merchant vessels and forcing the Royal Navy into exhausting hunts across the globe. However, the logistical and strategic limitations remained the same, and as Allied radar, code-breaking, and air power improved, raiders found it increasingly difficult to operate undetected. By 1941 and 1942, the danger from surface raiders, though real, was overshadowed by the scale of the U-boat Menace. Still, the memory of the Graf Spee lingered, a reminder of the drama and unpredictability of naval warfare. For the men who fought at the River Plate, the battle was a testament to courage and endurance against odds. For the broader war, it was a demonstration of how even single ships could influence global strategy. The Atlantic War was not only fought in silence beneath the waves, but also in sudden clashes that reverberated across continents. The saga of the Graf Spee and Germany's surface raiders remains a vivid chapter in the history of the Battle of the Atlantic, a tale of boldness, sacrifice, and strategic limitation. These ships carried the hopes of the Kriegsmarine to challenge Britain's dominance, but their impact was fleeting compared to the relentless efficiency of U-boats. The River Plate revealed that surface raiders could inspire fear and deliver spectacle, but could not alter the fundamental balance of power at sea. Their successes forced the Allies to adapt, stretching resources and sharpening coordination, but their failures proved decisive in shifting German focus towards submarines. The lessons of this era echoed throughout the remainder of the conflict, shaping decisions on both sides. For the sailors who lived through it, the memory was indelible: the sight of burning ships, the thunder of naval guns, and the knowledge that a single vessel could draw nations into conflict. The Atlantic, vast and unforgiving, demanded endurance and adaptation, qualities that would define the battles yet to come. The story of the Graf Spee was both an ending and a beginning, foreshadowing the greater struggles that awaited in the endless war for the Atlantic lifeline. By 1940, Britain stood as Europe's last bastion against Nazi domination, and the Atlantic lifeline became the fragile thread upon which its survival depended. The fall of France in June stripped Britain of continental allies and brought German U-boats closer to the western approaches, using ports like Lorient and Saint-Nazaire as forward bases. With these new positions, U-boats could surge into the Atlantic in greater numbers, extending their hunting grounds far beyond what had been possible in 1939. The effect was immediate and devastating, as merchant ships fell victim to torpedo attacks with alarming frequency. In the last 6 months of 1940 alone, over 3 million tons of shipping were sent to the seabed, a scale of loss Britain could scarcely afford. German commanders hailed this as their happy time, when the Atlantic seemed to tilt in their favor. British escorts, already stretched thin, now faced relentless attacks by Wolfpacks coordinated from bases just across the Channel. The isolation of Britain was no longer a distant possibility, but an imminent danger. For Churchill, the battle for the Atlantic was not abstract strategy, but a nightmare that haunted his every waking hour. Merchant ship shortages quickly became the most pressing crisis facing Britain. Every freighter lost represented months of work, thousands of tons of cargo, and dozens of trained sailors who could not easily be replaced. British shipyards, already tasked with building warships, struggled to keep pace with losses that threatened to cripple industry and civilian life alike. The government launched emergency programs to accelerate shipbuilding, turning out hastily constructed but serviceable freighters known as Liberty ships, in partnership with American yards. Yet, even with this effort, sinkings outstripped construction, creating a deficit that grew month by month. The merchant fleet, once the pride of Britain's global empire, was shrinking at a terrifying pace. Without replacement tonnage, the convoy system itself was at risk of collapse, for there would simply not be enough ships to sail. The scale of destruction forced the Admiralty to prioritize vital cargoes, often leaving non-essential goods behind in port. Britain's maritime lifeblood was draining away before the eyes of its leaders, and the crisis threatened to undo the nation's capacity to fight. The sea, once Britain's greatest protector, had become its most dangerous enemy. The impact of U-boat successes was felt most sharply in the ration books that governed daily life across the British Isles. Food shortages forced the government to introduce strict rationing, limiting everything from meat and sugar to butter and tea. Civilians queued in long lines outside shops, clutching coupons that represented their weekly allotment, often returning home with less than they hoped. Fresh fruit became a rarity, and luxuries disappeared entirely, replaced by ingenuity in kitchens across the country. Housewives experimented with powdered eggs and ersatz coffee, while children grew up on diets shaped by necessity rather than choice. Fuel rationing also altered daily life, restricting travel and dimming streetlights as coal and oil supplies dwindled. These hardships bred resilience, but also fatigue, as the population faced not only the threat of bombs from the air, but hunger from the sea. Every torpedoed freighter meant tighter rations, harsher shortages, and deeper sacrifice. The civilian population bore the weight of the Atlantic War, as much as sailors on the convoys, tied to the ebb and flow of cargo arriving or failing to arrive at British ports. The struggle against hunger was itself a battlefront in the Atlantic campaign. Winston Churchill understood better than anyone the peril posed by the Atlantic campaign. In his memoirs, he confessed that the U-boat Menace was the only threat that truly frightened him, more than the Luftwaffe or even the possibility of invasion. For Churchill, the arithmetic of tonnage was unforgiving. If ships were lost faster than they could be built or protected, Britain would starve. He pressed his admiralty and scientific advisors for solutions, demanding innovations in detection, weapons, and escort tactics. He also lobbied President Roosevelt for American support, emphasizing that Britain's ability to fight depended on keeping the Atlantic open. Churchill's speeches reflected his awareness of the crisis, urging civilians to endure rationing with stoicism, while praising the courage of merchant and naval sailors. His leadership provided morale but also revealed the fragility of Britain's position. Behind closed doors, he wrestled with the grim possibility that the Atlantic Lifeline might fail, leaving Britain isolated. The Prime Minister's greatest fear was that the war could be lost not on the battlefield, but in the silent war at sea. The Atlantic became his personal obsession, a struggle he followed with relentless urgency. Public morale during these years was tested as never before, stretched between defiance and despair. News of shipping losses was often kept vague to avoid demoralizing the population, but rumors and whispered reports circulated in every town. Families with loved ones in the Merchant Navy or Royal Navy lived in constant anxiety, dreading the knock at the door bearing grim news. Yet the British people endured, drawing strength from a culture of resilience forged during the Blitz, and from Churchill's unyielding rhetoric. Civilians took pride in the sacrifices of merchant sailors, recognizing that their hardship at sea sustained life on land. Posters and propaganda reminded citizens that every scrap saved at home reduced the pressure on vulnerable supply lines. Blackouts, rationing, and shortages became symbols of shared sacrifice rather than reasons for surrender. Still, the strain was evident, and moments of despair crept in when food grew scarce or when sinkings made headlines. The morale of the nation mirrored the fortunes of the Atlantic campaign, rising with convoy arrivals and sinking with news of disaster. Britain's spirit remained unbroken, but it was sorely tested by the invisible battle waged across the waves. The U-boat's successes in 1940 and 1941 reshaped global strategy, forcing the Allies to confront the full scale of the Atlantic crisis. Britain appealed to Canada, which stepped forward to shoulder a growing share of escort duties, expanding its navy far beyond peacetime limits. The United States, still officially neutral, began providing vital assistance through the Destroyers for Bases deal and Lend-Lease agreements. American shipyards ramped up production of Liberty ships, and American naval patrols extended farther into the Atlantic, foreshadowing their eventual full entry into the war. These developments provided hope, but they could not immediately stem the tide of sinkings. U-boats, emboldened by their happy time, prowled even closer to British shores, sometimes attacking within sight of coastal towns. The Allies found themselves fighting not only for survival, but for time, racing to build the ships, escorts, and aircraft that could turn the tide. The Atlantic campaign had become a global effort, drawing on resources and manpower from across the world. Britain's survival hinged on this expanding alliance, even as losses continued to mount. The war at sea had become not just Britain's battle, but the Allies' collective struggle. By the end of 1941, Britain's position remained precarious, but the seeds of eventual resilience had been planted. The convoy system, though battered, had proven indispensable, and the lessons of coordination and defense were beginning to bear fruit. Canada and the United States were increasingly engaged, providing escorts, ships, and resources that bolstered Britain's fragile lifeline. Technological innovations, though still imperfect, were advancing, with radar and sonar offering glimpses of future effectiveness. Civilians, though weary, continued to endure rationing and hardship with remarkable resilience, embodying the determination to resist at all costs. Churchill, though haunted by the U-boat menace, drew confidence from the growing strength of Britain's allies and the stubborn courage of its sailors. Germany, meanwhile, celebrated its happy time, unaware that the tide would eventually shift against them as Allied resources multiplied. Britain remained under siege, its lifeline strained but unbroken, its people scarred but resolute. The years 1940 and 1941 marked the darkest hours of the Atlantic War, a crucible of survival that defined the nation's endurance. In the endless struggle against the U-boats, Britain's will to live and fight became its greatest weapon. In the early years of the Battle of the Atlantic, the United States stood officially neutral, bound by a policy of non-intervention, but increasingly drawn into the conflict by economic, political, and moral ties. President Franklin D. Roosevelt recognized that Britain's survival was essential to America's own security, even as isolationist voices in Congress urged caution. The Atlantic Ocean, once seen as a barrier protecting the United States from Europe's wars, had become a corridor of danger, with German U-boats prowling ever closer to the American coastline. Roosevelt introduced neutrality patrols in 1939, deploying American warships and aircraft to monitor the Western Atlantic. Though framed as protective measures for U.S. waters, these patrols effectively provided intelligence and indirect escort support to British convoys. The policy blurred the line between neutrality and participation, signaling that America was already leaning toward the Allied cause. Roosevelt understood that neutrality could not mean indifference, not when the balance of world power was at stake. For Germany, this creeping American involvement was both a warning and a provocation. The seeds of full US entry into the war were being sown in the waters of the Atlantic. One of the earliest and most symbolic acts of US support came in September 1940 with the Destroyers for Bases Agreement. Under this deal, the United States transferred 50 aging destroyers to Britain in exchange for leases on bases in the Caribbean, Newfoundland, and Bermuda. Though the destroyers were worn and dated, they were desperately needed, filling gaps in the Royal Navy's escort forces at a time of crisis. The bases, meanwhile, gave the United States strategic footholds in the Atlantic, strengthening its defensive perimeter while extending its reach toward Europe. The agreement was more than a trade of ships for land, it was a clear statement of political alignment. Roosevelt bypassed isolationist critics by framing the deal as a practical exchange rather than an act of war. Yet for Britain, the arrival of these destroyers represented lifelines, steel reinforcements in a battle where every escort counted. For Germany, the deal confirmed what they had long suspected. The United States was not neutral in spirit, even if it was in law. The destroyers became symbols of solidarity, rusted but reliable, sailing into the heart of the Atlantic struggle. The policy of Lend-Lease, introduced in March 1941, marked an even greater step toward American involvement. This program authorized the United States to supply Britain, and later other Allied nations, with war materials, food, and equipment on credit, with repayment deferred until after the war. Roosevelt described it as lending a neighbor a garden hose to put out a fire before it spread, a metaphor that resonated with a wary public. Lend-Lease poured weapons, aircraft, vehicles, and supplies into Britain, sustaining both military operations and civilian survival. Merchant convoys now carried crates stamped with American markings, their arrival boosting morale and reinforcing the sense of partnership across the Atlantic. The program also provided logistical support for the Soviet Union, further broadening America's role in sustaining resistance against the Axis. Though still short of a declaration of war, Lend-Lease tied the United States irrevocably to the Allied cause. It signaled to Germany that America's vast industrial strength was already in motion, preparing to overwhelm them. Each shipment that reached British shores was more than cargo. It was a promise of continued resistance underwritten by American resolve. As 1941 progressed, American naval presence in the Atlantic expanded, further eroding the line between neutrality and war. U.S. warships began escorting convoys as far as Iceland, providing protection across routes increasingly plagued by U-boat attacks. Naval patrols shadowed German submarines, reporting their positions to British escorts, effectively acting as silent partners in convoy defense. The U.S. Navy also clashed directly with German U-boats in incidents that tested the limits of neutrality. In September, the destroyer USS Greer was attacked after tracking and reporting the location of a German U-boat to British forces, an incident that Roosevelt used to justify more aggressive measures. The clash was followed weeks later by the torpedoing of USS Kearney and the sinking of USS Reuben James, both escorting convoys in the Atlantic. These incidents shocked the American public, demonstrating that neutrality no longer guaranteed safety when German submarines roamed so close to U.S. shores. Roosevelt responded by declaring a shoot-on-sight policy, authorizing American warships to fire upon U-boats if threatened. Though the United States had not formally entered the war, its navy was already fighting a shadow conflict in the Atlantic. Each encounter edged America closer to full involvement, testing both the patience of isolationists and the resolve of the administration. For Britain, the sight of American destroyers in convoy lanes offered both practical protection and symbolic reassurance. For Germany, it confirmed that the Atlantic was becoming contested ground with a new and formidable opponent. Neutrality was dissolving into armed support, a transition that reshaped the balance of power on the seas. The increasing U.S. presence in the Atlantic brought profound strategic implications. American shipyards, already mobilized under the banner of Lend-Lease, began producing escorts and Liberty ships at an industrial pace unmatched by any Axis power. Naval bases acquired through the destroyers for bases deal extended the range of U.S. aircraft and patrols, shrinking the once vulnerable mid-Atlantic gap. The United States Navy trained aggressively, preparing escort groups that would soon become central to Allied convoy protection. Roosevelt balanced this military buildup with careful rhetoric, assuring the public that America was defending its own interests even as it safeguarded Britain. Yet the truth was evident. The United States had become the arsenal of democracy, its factories and shipyards fueling the Allied war machine. The Atlantic was no longer solely Britain's burden. It was now a transatlantic struggle in which American industrial and naval might played an increasingly decisive role. Germany faced the looming specter of American power, a foe whose resources dwarfed its own. The Atlantic, once a vulnerable lifeline, was slowly becoming a bridge between allies. Neutrality had become a mask, hiding an alliance already forged in practice. Despite this growing support, American involvement before Pearl Harbor remained controversial at home. Isolationist groups such as the America First Committee warned against entangling alliances, arguing that aiding Britain would only drag the United States into another European war. Senators and congressmen clashed over Lend-Lease, debating whether it was an act of generosity or a dangerous provocation. Public opinion was divided, shaped by memories of the First World War and a desire to avoid repeating its mistakes. Roosevelt, however, skillfully navigated this political landscape, framing each step as defensive rather than offensive. Neutrality patrols were said to protect American waters. Destroyer deals were presented as practical exchanges. Lend-Lease was cast as neighborly aid. Yet beneath the rhetoric, America's actions were unmistakably aligned with the Allies. The public may have hesitated, but events at sea, the sinking of US ships and the deaths of American sailors, shifted sentiment steadily toward engagement. The Atlantic campaign became a crucible where the tension between neutrality and responsibility was tested. By late 1941, the debate was becoming academic, for war seemed inevitable. The Atlantic had already drawn America into its embrace. By December 1941, on the eve of Pearl Harbor, American neutrality in the Atlantic had become neutrality in name only. US warships escorted convoys, engaged U-boats, and guarded shipping lanes stretching across thousands of miles. American industry churned out supplies at a pace that dwarfed Britain's capacity, ensuring that the island nation remained armed and fed despite relentless losses. Roosevelt's steady escalation had transformed the United States from bystander to participant, setting the stage for full entry into the war. For Germany, the creeping involvement of America foreshadowed a nightmare, a coalition of powers united by sea, supplied by an industrial giant across the Atlantic. For Britain, it was salvation, a guarantee that the lifeline would not be severed. The Battle of the Atlantic, once a duel between U-boats and convoys, had become a transoceanic struggle, with America's shadow looming large. Neutrality had evolved into partnership, and partnership would soon become alliance. The seeds planted by patrols, deals, and aid would bear fruit in the years to come, as American power turned the tide of the Atlantic War. The stage was set for global conflict, and the ocean was its bridge. From mid-1940 into 1941, the Atlantic became a killing ground where German U-boats reigned supreme, a period remembered by their commanders as the happy time. The fall of France had given the Kriegsmarine access to Atlantic ports like Lorient, Brest, and Saint-Nazaire, cutting days off their voyages and placing them directly in the heart of Britain's lifelines. From these bases, U-boats could sortie quickly into the western approaches, striking merchant convoys before escorts had time to assemble. The results were devastating, as sinkings multiplied and tonnage losses soared beyond Britain's capacity to replace. German submariners, emboldened by success, described the Atlantic as a hunting ground, with convoys serving as helpless prey. Merchant ships burned across the night horizon, their survivors clinging to rafts in frigid waters. The balance of fear shifted decisively as Britain struggled to adapt, with escorts too few and detection technology too primitive. The U-boat seemed unstoppable, striking with precision, vanishing beneath the waves, and surfacing again to reload and attack. For Germany, this was the closest the Atlantic War came to fulfilling Dönitz's vision of strangling Britain into submission. The happy time was not happy for the Allies. It was a nightmare of attrition and despair. The effectiveness of U-boats during this period owed much to their tactical and technological superiority. Wolfpack tactics, perfected under Admiral Karl Dönitz's direction, turned individual submarines into coordinated strike forces. Using encrypted radio communications, one U-boat would shadow a convoy and call in reinforcements, assembling a pack that attacked in waves under the cover of darkness. The Allies lacked the coordination to repel such assaults, with escorts overwhelmed by simultaneous strikes from multiple directions. German torpedoes, despite some early malfunctions, were now deadly reliable, capable of breaking the back of even the largest freighters. Submarines could surface at night and use their deck guns to finish crippled ships, conserving torpedoes for larger targets. Their small silhouettes made them nearly invisible against the dark ocean, while sonar technology used by escorts often failed to detect them in time. U-boats had the advantage of initiative, dictating when and where to strike. Each convoy crossing became a game of cat and mouse, in which the mouse seemed perpetually outmatched. The technological and tactical edge lay firmly with Germany, and Britain paid the price in lives and cargo. The scale of losses during the happy time was staggering, pushing Britain closer to the brink of collapse. In 1940 alone, over 1,000 merchant ships were sunk, representing millions of tons of supplies that never reached British shores. Tankers carrying vital oil went down in flames, their black smoke towering against the sky as escorts fought desperately to save survivors. Food shipments dwindled, forcing the government to tighten rationing further, while factories faced shortages of raw materials. Each month brought grim statistics of sinkings that outpaced new construction, widening the gap between loss and replacement. Entire convoys disappeared beneath coordinated attacks, their names etched into naval records as tragedies of endurance and sacrifice. For Britain, the numbers were not abstract. They translated into hunger, scarcity, and a gnawing fear that survival was slipping away. Civilians read newspaper reports that understated the crisis but could not mask the growing hardship. Sailors, both naval and civilian, sailed knowing the odds were stacked against them. The tonnage war, measured in steel and human lives, was tipping dangerously in Germany's favor. For the Germans, the happy time was celebrated as proof of the U-boat's supremacy and the courage of its crews. Commanders like Otto Kretschmer, known as Silent Otto, rose to legendary status, sinking ships with ruthless efficiency while minimizing risks to his men. Kretschmer alone accounted for over 200,000 tons of shipping, his name becoming synonymous with fear on the Atlantic. Other U-boat aces such as Joachim Schepke and Günther Prien, hero of Scapa Flow, were immortalized in propaganda as knights of the sea. Their successes were trumpeted in newspapers and on radio broadcasts, inspiring pride at home and boosting morale within the Kriegsmarine. For Dönitz, these victories vindicated his long-held belief that submarines were Germany's true weapon against Britain. Each commander became part of a cult of personality, rewarded with medals and fame as the embodiment of German naval prowess. The German public, shielded from the human suffering inflicted, saw only the glory of victories tallied in tonnage. The happy time cemented the U-boat's place as the spearhead of Germany's war at sea. Yet even in triumph, cracks began to form in the strategy that promised quick victory. The British struggled desperately to counter the Menace, but their tools were limited and their learning curve steep. Escort shortages meant many convoys sailed with inadequate protection, particularly in the treacherous mid-Atlantic gap where aircraft could not reach. Sonar, then called ASDIC, could only detect submarines directly beneath escorts, failing to track those maneuvering on the surface at night. Radar was still in its infancy, limited in range and reliability, offering little help in detecting surfaced U-boats. Air patrols could protect convoys near coasts, but left vast stretches of ocean unguarded, creating safe hunting grounds for Wolfpacks. Depth charges were crude, often dropped blindly, with little guarantee of success against evasive submarines. The Admiralty scrambled to train escort commanders, but coordination remained inconsistent, leaving convoys vulnerable to surprise attacks. Many ships continued to sail independently despite warnings, preferring speed over the delays of convoy organization, and paid the price. For Britain, each crossing was a gamble with odds heavily tilted toward disaster. The lack of effective countermeasures ensured that the happy time endured far longer than it should have. The impact on morale was profound, both at sea and on land. Merchant sailors, the lifeblood of Britain's survival, endured journeys haunted by the constant threat of sudden annihilation. Survivors' accounts spoke of nights broken by explosions, of ships vanishing in seconds, and of men left adrift in freezing waters. The fear of the U-boat was not abstract, but immediate, a terror that stalked every mile of the ocean. Civilians, though largely shielded from the worst news, felt the strain in shortages, rationing, and the omnipresent spectre of hunger. Churchill's speeches reassured the nation, but he admitted privately that the U-boat threat was his greatest fear. For sailors on the escorts, the battle was relentless, marked by long hours of watchfulness, sudden alarms, and the anguish of failing to save torpedoed comrades. The psychological burden was immense, eroding confidence and heightening fatigue. Germany, meanwhile, exulted in propaganda victories, portraying Britain as on the verge of collapse. The battle of nerves was as decisive as the battle of tonnage. The happy time inflicted wounds not just on fleets, but on the very spirit of a nation. By the close of 1941, the happy time had reached its peak, but the tide of fortune was beginning to shift. Britain, though battered, refused to surrender, pouring resources into escort production, radar improvement, and air patrol expansion. Canada and the United States increased their contributions, sending more ships and aircraft to patrol the Atlantic. Convoy tactics became sharper, with escorts learning to fight as coordinated groups rather than isolated defenders. Technological innovations such as improved sonar and longer-range aircraft began to promise relief, though their full effect was yet to be felt. For Germany, the triumph of the happy time bred overconfidence, fostering the illusion that victory was within reach. Dönitz pressed for more submarines, but production lagged behind demand, limiting his ability to sustain pressure. The losses inflicted on Britain were immense, but not decisive. The island endured, scarred but unbroken, awaiting the reinforcements and innovations that would gradually turn the tide. The happy time was remembered in Germany as a golden era, but in reality it was the beginning of a long grinding struggle. The Atlantic War was far from over, it had only entered its deadliest phase. One of the most decisive battles of the Atlantic War was fought not on the waves but in the shadows of cryptography rooms, where mathematicians and linguists sought to pierce the secrets of the German Enigma machine. This device, with its rotating rotors and interchangeable plugs, created coded messages so complex that the Germans believed them unbreakable. Each message generated billions of possible combinations, and the codes changed daily, making decryption seem an impossible task. Yet the Allies understood that intelligence was as vital as weapons, for knowing the movements of U-boats could save thousands of lives and millions of tons of cargo. The first breakthroughs came not from Britain but from Poland, where mathematicians like Marian Rejewski, Jerzy Różicki, and Henryk Zygalski had already made strides in reconstructing the machine's logic. Their work, conducted in secrecy before the war, laid the foundation for everything that followed. As the storm of war gathered, the Poles shared their knowledge with Britain and France, handing over precious intelligence in a desperate bid for collective survival. It was a gift that would prove invaluable, a spark that lit the path toward eventual victory. The story of Enigma was one of persistence, ingenuity, and international cooperation against tyranny. When war erupted, Britain took up the challenge of cracking Enigma with renewed urgency, establishing a secret centre at Bletchley Park, a Victorian mansion in Buckinghamshire. This unassuming estate became the headquarters of the most sophisticated code-breaking operation in history, staffed by brilliant minds drawn from mathematics, linguistics, engineering, and even crossword competitions. Among its most notable figures was Alan Turing, a mathematician whose unconventional genius would prove central to the effort. Bletchley Park's work was divided into huts, each specializing in a particular task, from naval codes to Luftwaffe communications. The atmosphere was intense, marked by long hours, constant secrecy, and the pressure of knowing that lives depended on every breakthrough. The Germans believed their codes impregnable, yet the men and women of Bletchley approached the task with creativity and determination. They developed both theoretical methods and practical machines to untangle Enigma's complexity. The operation was so secret that most of its participants could not even discuss their work with one another, bound by the strictest security. Out of this hidden world would come one of the greatest intelligence triumphs of the Second World War. Alan Turing's contribution was revolutionary, transforming code-breaking from a manual art into a mechanical science. Building upon Polish innovations, he designed an electromechanical device known as the bomber, capable of testing thousands of Enigma settings in rapid succession. The bomber searched for logical contradictions in encoded messages, eliminating impossible combinations until the correct one emerged. This breakthrough drastically reduced the time required to break daily keys, turning the theoretical possibility of decryption into a practical reality. Turing's work, supported by colleagues like Gordon Welchman, transformed Bletchley Park into a factory of intelligence, where raw intercepts were converted into actionable information. Each solved code revealed the positions of U-boats, their orders, and their patrol routes. For the first time, convoys could be rerouted away from ambushes, saving countless ships from destruction. Turing's machines were not perfect, and the process still required ingenuity and intuition, but they shifted the balance decisively. By mechanizing code breaking, Turing ensured that the Allies could keep pace with Enigma's constant changes. His genius made mathematics a weapon as powerful as any torpedo or depth charge. The flow of intelligence from Enigma decrypts became known by the codename Ultra, a closely guarded secret whose importance was rivaled only by the Manhattan Project. Ultra gave Allied commanders a window into the hidden world of German strategy, transforming the Battle of the Atlantic. Instead of reacting blindly to losses, convoys could now be steered away from danger, while escorts could be concentrated to ambush unsuspecting Wolfpacks. The information had to be used carefully, however, for if the Germans suspected Enigma was compromised, they would change their systems entirely. This required subtlety, disguising intelligence as the product of reconnaissance or chance. At times, ships had to be sacrificed to preserve the secret, a moral burden that haunted those who held Ultra in their hands. The effectiveness of the decrypts was immense. Entire Wolfpacks were routed, supply ships intercepted, and U-boats destroyed. Churchill himself described Ultra as decisive in winning the war, remarking that it was thanks to this intelligence that the Battle of the Atlantic was won. Ultra became the Allies' invisible shield, its power measured not in ships sunk but in ships saved. The German Navy, led by Admiral Dönitz, constantly modified its use of Enigma, introducing additional rotors and procedural changes to preserve secrecy. Each modification threatened to lock the Allies out, plunging them back into blindness until new methods were devised. The most dramatic crisis came in early 1942, when the introduction of the four-rotor naval Enigma temporarily silenced Bletchley Park's decrypts. Losses skyrocketed, and the Battle of the Atlantic teetered on disaster once again. But through persistence, captured codebooks, and ingenuity, the codebreakers eventually restored their access, regaining the edge that had been momentarily lost. This cat-and-mouse game highlighted the fragile nature of intelligence, a struggle fought not only with machines, but with human determination. Each breakthrough was hard-won, the result of sleepless nights and relentless problem-solving by men and women working in silence. For the Allies, the temporary blackout was a stark reminder of how dependent their survival had become on Ultra. For the Germans, unaware of the breach, it was business as usual, even as their secrets spilled into enemy hands. The duel over Enigma was a hidden front, invisible but decisive. The story of Enigma was not solely a triumph of intellect. It was also a story of sacrifice and risk on the high seas. Critical to code-breaking were captures of Enigma machines and codebooks from German vessels, often obtained through daring naval operations. Boarding parties braved enemy fire to retrieve documents from sinking U-boats, while sailors risked their lives to salvage intelligence before it could be destroyed. One of the most famous examples came in 1941, when HMS Bulldog forced U-110 to the surface and seized its Enigma machine before it sank. These victories provided the raw material Bletchley Park needed to maintain momentum against ever-changing codes. Without them, even Turing's brilliance would have faltered, for machines alone could not provide daily keys. Each capture was a deadly gamble, fought in seconds against crews determined to scuttle their secrets. The bravery of these sailors complemented the genius of the codebreakers, uniting sea and science in a partnership that turned the tide. Intelligence became a weapon wielded by both those who fought in silence on land and those who risked their lives at sea. By 1943, the cumulative impact of Enigma breakthroughs was undeniable, tilting the balance of the Atlantic War toward the Allies. Wolfpacks that once hunted with impunity now found themselves ambushed, their patrol lines anticipated, and their rendezvous points exposed. Convoy survival rates improved, and losses began to decline, even as the U-boats pressed harder than ever. Ultra-intelligence allowed the Allies to coordinate air and naval forces with precision, striking submarines before they could strike convoys. For Churchill and his commanders, the triumph of code-breaking was not merely technical, but existential, ensuring that Britain's lifeline endured. After the war, the secrecy of Ultra was maintained for decades, leaving the public unaware of the hidden struggle that had saved them. Only later did the world learn how mathematics, machines, and human brilliance had rewritten the rules of warfare. Breaking Enigma was not just a victory of codes, it was a victory of perseverance, creativity, and international cooperation. In the quiet halls of Bletchley Park, the tide of the Atlantic was turned, proving that battles are not always won by guns and torpedoes, but sometimes by the minds that outthink them. When Germany declared war on the United States in December 1941, Admiral Karl Donitz seized the opportunity to expand the U-boat war into new waters. The American coastline, stretching from Maine to Florida and into the Gulf of Mexico, presented a target-rich environment unlike any other. Merchant ships, tankers, and coastal freighters sailed independently, often fully illuminated against city lights that glowed along the shoreline. The Kriegsmarine called this new campaign Parkenschlag, or Operation Drumbeat, envisioning it as a devastating blow against the unprepared Americans. In January 1942, the first wave of U-boats crossed the Atlantic and began their attacks. Within days, ships were burning within sight of East Coast beaches, their flames visible to horrified civilians on shore. The effect was catastrophic, as the U-boats sank tonnage at a pace even greater than during the earlier happy time near Britain. The Germans had brought the war to America's doorstep, catching the US Navy flat-footed. This new phase became known as the Second Happy Time for the U-boat arm, a period of unchecked success. It was a sobering reminder that the Atlantic War was truly global, reaching even into the waters of the Western Hemisphere. The vulnerability of the American coastline stemmed from unpreparedness and misplaced confidence. Unlike Britain, which had endured years of hard lessons under siege, the United States entered the war with little practical experience in convoy protection. The Navy possessed powerful battleships and aircraft carriers, but few of the small escorts and corvettes best suited to defending merchantmen. Worse still, US officials initially resisted implementing coastal convoys, fearing the delays and logistical challenges they might cause. As a result, merchant ships continued to sail independently, making them easy prey for submarines lying in wait. German captains could simply sit offshore and watch as freighters steamed by, their lights visible against the glow of coastal cities that refused to dim. Radio silence and evasive tactics were often ignored, leaving vessels exposed. The result was slaughter, with dozens of ships destroyed in the opening weeks of the campaign. America's naval might counted for little when applied in the wrong places, and the U-boats exploited every weakness. This failure to adapt quickly turned the eastern seaboard into one of the most dangerous waters in the world. For the German submariners, the American campaign was astonishing in its ease and success. U-boat captains later recalled their disbelief at how defenseless the American coast proved to be. Tankers laden with oil, crucial to Allied industry, were prime targets, exploding in massive fireballs that lit the night sky. Merchantmen steamed in predictable patterns, their positions often revealed by careless radio transmissions. In the first half of 1942 alone, more than 3 million tons of shipping were sunk off the US coast, dwarfing losses in other theaters. The Germans called it the second happy time, reveling in a campaign that brought them glory and tonnage beyond expectation. Propaganda celebrated the daring of U-boat crews who operated so boldly under the shadow of America's great cities. Civilians from Cape Hatteras to New York watched helplessly as ships burned offshore, the war arriving on their very horizons. The U-boats seemed unstoppable, surfacing even to attack with deck guns when torpedoes ran low. For a time, the Atlantic War tilted decisively in Germany's favor, and the Allies faced the prospect of disaster. The triumph of the U-boats was total, at least temporarily. The scale of destruction inflicted upon America's merchant fleet highlighted the imbalance between preparation and reality. U-boats prowled the Gulf of Mexico, sinking tankers bound for refineries in Texas and Louisiana, severing vital petroleum supplies. Caribbean routes, carrying bauxite, oil, and other resources, became hunting grounds as German submarines extended their reach into new waters. Ports like Jacksonville, New Orleans, and Trinidad witnessed chaos as survivors staggered ashore, while communities dealt with the shock of war so close to home. Insurance rates soared, shipping companies demanded protection, and public outrage grew at the government's slow response. The Navy scrambled to plug the gaps, deploying whatever vessels it could spare, from old destroyers to hastily converted yachts and cutters. Yet the shortage of escorts remained dire, and convoys were still resisted by some officials who underestimated the scale of the threat. The result was a continued hemorrhage of tonnage that dwarfed losses elsewhere. America's entry into the war had not immediately solved the Atlantic crisis. Instead, it deepened it. The second happy time was as much about American mistakes as German success. It was a painful lesson in the cost of unpreparedness. Eventually, the tide began to turn as the United States absorbed its losses and applied the hard-earned lessons of its allies. Coastal blackouts were enforced, dimming cities that had previously illuminated the paths of merchantmen. Convoy systems were finally implemented along the eastern seaboard and into the Gulf, grouping ships under the protection of whatever escorts could be assembled. Air patrols expanded, with long-range bombers flying from coastal bases to deter submarine activity. British and Canadian officers shared their expertise, training American counterparts in the art of anti-submarine warfare. Slowly, the chaos gave way to order, and sinkings along the coast began to decline. The initial devastation, however, had already taken its toll, delaying the Allied build-up and straining resources. German captains, though still successful, now faced greater risks, forcing them to operate farther offshore. The Americans had awakened to the reality of the Atlantic War, but their early complacency had cost dearly. The lesson was clear: survival at sea depended on discipline, coordination, and vigilance. Without these, even the mightiest navy could be humbled. For the Germans, the second happy time was both a triumph and a missed opportunity. The destruction inflicted was enormous, but Dönitz had too few U-boats to press the advantage decisively. Despite repeated pleas, Hitler had prioritized other projects, leaving the U-boat arm without the hundreds of submarines Dönitz believed necessary to strangle Allied shipping completely. Each U-boat could only sink so much before needing to return for resupply, and the vastness of the American coast diluted their strength. Moreover, Allied innovations in code-breaking and air patrols soon eroded the advantage. By mid-1942, Wolfpacks faced increasing resistance, and losses mounted as escorts and aircraft became more effective. The window of opportunity that had seemed so wide in January was closing rapidly by summer. For the Allies, this was a reprieve born of adaptation and industrial strength. For Germany, it was a reminder that victory in the Atlantic could never be guaranteed. The second happy time was glorious in memory, but insufficient in reality. It showed what U-boats could achieve, but also revealed the limits of their power. By the end of 1942, the U-boat campaign off the Americas had lost its initial dominance, but its impact lingered. Thousands of sailors had been killed, millions of tons of cargo lost, and entire communities along the coast had tasted the terror of war firsthand. The Atlantic had proven itself not just Britain's battle, but a shared ordeal stretching from Halifax to Havana, from New York to New Orleans. America, once distant from the front lines, now understood the stakes with brutal clarity. The lessons learned in fire and blood would shape U.S. naval policy for the remainder of the war, driving investment in escorts, aircraft, and coordination. The second happy time was remembered as the last uncontested triumph of the U-boat arm, but also as the moment when American complacency gave way to determination. The campaign forged the resolve that would eventually see the Allies dominate the Atlantic through sheer strength of industry and organization. What began as humiliation ended as a transformation, turning America into a fully committed partner in the battle for the seas. The coastlines, once ablaze with burning ships, became strongholds of defense. The tide, slowly but surely, was beginning to turn. From the earliest days of the Battle of the Atlantic, aircraft promised to be the Allies' great equalizer against the stealth of the U-boats. The skies over the ocean offered a vantage point no escort ship could match, with pilots able to scan vast stretches of sea in a single patrol. Yet in 1939 and 1940, the promise of air power remained limited by range, endurance, and technology. Coastal Command of the Royal Air Force, tasked with protecting convoys, flew outdated and short-ranged aircraft that could only patrol the waters close to Britain's shores. German submarines, aware of these limitations, lurked just beyond their reach, waiting to ambush convoys as they sailed into the open Atlantic. Early encounters proved the potential of aircraft. U-boats caught on the surface were vulnerable, unable to dive quickly enough to evade bombs or machine gun fire. But these victories were few, and the ocean was far too vast to be effectively covered with the aircraft available. The air war over the Atlantic began as a struggle of reach, how far planes could fly before fuel forced them home. Until that problem was solved, the U-boats held the advantage. The importance of long-range patrol aircraft grew clearer with each passing month, as convoy after convoy was mauled in waters beyond the protection of shore-based planes. The most dangerous stretch was the infamous mid-Atlantic gap, a broad expanse of ocean where no Allied aircraft could patrol, leaving convoys naked before the Wolfpacks. Sailors referred to it grimly as the Black Pit, a place where they knew attacks were inevitable and help was far away. The Germans exploited this vulnerability ruthlessly, concentrating their submarines in the gap and striking convoys with devastating effect. Coastal Command lobbied desperately for longer-range aircraft, but resources were limited and priorities often shifted toward bomber campaigns over Germany. The situation created frustration and resentment, as merchant sailors paid the price for strategic choices made on land. It was not until the arrival of American B-24 Liberators and other long-range planes that the gap began to close. These aircraft extended the protective umbrella far into the ocean, gradually shrinking the hunting grounds available to the U-boats. The battle for the skies over the Atlantic was not glamorous, but it was critical to survival. When long-range patrols finally became a consistent presence, they changed the tempo of the Atlantic War. U-boats, once comfortable cruising on the surface to recharge batteries and communicate with their Wolfpacks, now faced sudden death from above. Aircraft could strike without warning, swooping low to drop depth charges or bombs before submarines had time to submerge. Pilots learned to recognize the telltale signs of a U-boat, an oil slick, a periscope wake, or the shadow of a conning tower against the waves. Escorts, guided by reconnaissance planes, could be vectored directly onto targets, compressing the time between detection and attack. U-boats, once the hunters became increasingly hunted, their commanders forced to adapt to constant aerial surveillance. The element of surprise, so vital to Donitz's Wolfpack strategy, was eroded by the persistence of aircraft. Convoys sailed with greater confidence when they knew the skies were patrolled, even if the enemy remained lurking beneath. The presence of aircraft turned the vast Atlantic from a predator's playground into contested ground, where submarines no longer moved with impunity. The development of technology enhanced the effectiveness of aircraft in ways that multiplied their impact far beyond simple patrols. Radar, initially bulky and imprecise, became increasingly powerful, allowing aircraft to detect U-boats even at night or in poor weather. Airborne radar sets, mounted on patrol planes, turned darkness from a shield into a liability for submarines. Ley lights, powerful searchlights mounted on aircraft, illuminated U-boats caught on the surface during nighttime patrols, giving them no chance to escape before depth charges rained down. High-frequency direction finding, or HF/DF, allowed aircraft to triangulate the positions of U-boats by tracking their radio transmissions. Each of these innovations chipped away at the invisibility that had made submarines so deadly. For U-boat crews, the ocean grew more dangerous by the month, as the skies themselves seemed to betray their positions. For Allied airmen, technology magnified their reach, turning patrols into lethal missions that shifted the balance of the war. Science and skill worked hand in hand to bring the submarine threat under control. Air power also played a critical role in bridging coordination between navies and merchant fleets. Aircraft flying overhead reassured convoy sailors, acting as eyes in the sky that could spot dangers long before they reached the convoy. Communication between aircraft and escort ships improved steadily, with radio relays guiding destroyers and corvettes onto suspected U-boat contacts. Joint operations grew more sophisticated, with aircraft marking targets and escorts executing the kill. The synergy of air and sea power became a decisive factor, proving that survival lay not in isolated efforts, but in cooperation across domains. Coastal Command, once derided as the Cinderella service, emerged as a vital player in the Battle of the Atlantic. American naval aviation, too, expanded rapidly, deploying from bases in Newfoundland, Iceland, and the Azores to push patrols deep into the Atlantic. The integration of air cover into convoy operations was a slow but steady evolution forged through necessity and blood. By the end of 1942, it was clear that no convoy could survive without aircraft watching overhead. The age of joint warfare had arrived on the Atlantic waves. The psychological effect of aircraft on U-boat crews cannot be overstated. Sailors who once surfaced freely to recharge batteries or take in fresh air now lived in constant fear of sudden attack from above. The roar of an aircraft engine struck terror into crews, forcing crash dives that strained men and machinery alike. Long patrols grew exhausting, with submariners unable to rest properly, constantly scanning the skies. Commanders described the Atlantic as shrinking, no longer a vast expanse where they could roam at will, but a cage watched from every angle. For Allied sailors, the presence of patrol planes boosted morale, giving them a sense that they were not alone on the endless ocean. Survivors of torpedoed ships often owed their rescue to aircraft spotting lifeboats and directing escorts to the scene. Air power thus became a symbol of both threat and hope, fear for the U-boats, reassurance for the Allies. The battle for the Atlantic was as much about perception as reality, and aircraft shifted that perception decisively. By 1943, the cumulative effect of aircraft in the Atlantic campaign had become undeniable. The once feared mid-Atlantic gap had shrunk under the wings of long-range patrols, denying U-boats their safest hunting grounds. Radar, lee lights, and HF/DF turned the tide, making submarines visible even when they sought to hide. Coordinated strikes between aircraft and escorts inflicted mounting losses on the U-boat arm, reducing their effectiveness and morale. The happy times of U-boat dominance were gone, replaced by a grim reality of shrinking opportunities and rising casualties. For the Allies, the integration of air power was a turning point, ensuring that convoys arrived with greater safety and consistency. The Battle of the Atlantic remained brutal, but the balance had shifted in favor of endurance rather than attrition. Aircraft had proven themselves not just as support, but as decisive weapons in the longest campaign of the war. The skies over the Atlantic, once empty and vulnerable, had become guardians of survival. The U-boat menace was not yet ended, but it was no longer unstoppable. Air power had rewritten the rules of the ocean war. By late 1942, the Battle of the Atlantic was reaching its climax, a struggle that had pushed Britain to the brink of starvation and tested Allied resolve to its limits. For years, U-boats had stalked the shipping lanes with terrifying effectiveness, but the tide was beginning to shift. A combination of technological breakthroughs, tactical innovations, and relentless industrial effort was transforming the convoys from vulnerable targets into heavily defended fortresses at sea. The Allies had learned from bitter experience, adapting faster and applying resources on a scale Germany could not match. Convoy escorts grew in number and capability, no longer an afterthought but the centerpiece of survival. The coordination between ships, aircraft, and intelligence tightened, creating a web of protection that strangled Wolfpacks before they could strike. By 1943, the U-boat menace that once seemed insurmountable was faltering, its victories dwindling under the pressure of Allied superiority. The turning of the tide was not sudden, but gradual, built on countless small improvements that accumulated into overwhelming strength. It was the culmination of a long, bloody apprenticeship in survival at sea. One of the most decisive changes came with the expansion of escort fleets, which grew steadily thanks to the shipyards of Britain, Canada, and the United States. Destroyers, corvettes, and frigates poured off production lines, providing the muscle needed to protect merchantmen in every convoy. These ships, once scarce, now formed organized escort groups trained to fight U-boats with aggressive tactics. Canadian corvettes, small but resilient, became workhorses of the Atlantic, braving storms and attacks to guard freighters. British and American destroyers, faster and more heavily armed, patrolled the flanks, ready to charge at sonar contacts. Escort commanders no longer fought alone, but operated as coordinated teams supported by intelligence and air cover. Convoys that once sailed in fear now moved under the umbrella of a fleet dedicated to their survival. The improvement was not just in numbers but in training and doctrine, as escorts learned to anticipate Wolfpack tactics and respond with deadly efficiency. Each convoy crossing became a test of coordination, and increasingly, the Allies passed that test with growing confidence. Perhaps the most innovative addition to the convoy system was the escort carrier, a compact aircraft carrier converted from merchant hulls or built specifically for convoy defense. These small carriers brought air cover into the mid-Atlantic, closing the dreaded Black Pit that had once been the U-boat's safest hunting ground. Each escort carrier carried a modest complement of aircraft, typically fighters and bombers adapted for anti-submarine work. Though limited in size, their presence transformed convoy defense, allowing planes to launch directly from the convoy's heart. Pilots patrolled the skies, spotting submarines from above and directing escorts onto their prey. Depth charges and rockets carried by aircraft added another lethal layer to the defense, forcing U-boats to dive before they could position for attack. The psychological effect was immense, robbing submarine crews of their sense of security in the open ocean. What had once been a sanctuary was now contested airspace, where hunters became the hunted. Escort carriers symbolized the fusion of air and sea power, bridging the gap that had long plagued the Allies. They were floating guardians, compact yet decisive in altering the balance of the Atlantic War. Technology, too, advanced rapidly, providing the Allies with tools that turned the U-boat's greatest strength, their invisibility, into a weakness. Radar improved in range and accuracy, enabling escorts and aircraft to detect submarines on the surface even at night. Sonar, refined and deployed more widely, provided sharper tracking of underwater contacts. New weapons like the Hedgehog, a forward-firing spigot mortar, allowed escorts to launch patterns of explosives ahead of their bows, striking U-boats without losing sonar contact. Depth charges were refined with variable settings, capable of detonating at precise depths to maximize damage. High-frequency direction finding, or HFDUF, tracked U-boat radio transmissions, revealing their positions as they coordinated Wolfpack attacks. Each innovation was devastating on its own, but combined, they created a layered defense that eroded the U-boat advantage. The once invisible predator was now under constant surveillance, its survival dependent on evasion rather than dominance. Technology shifted the rhythm of the Atlantic War, making it increasingly perilous for submarines to remain on the offensive. Allied tactics evolved alongside technology, transforming the way convoys operated in contested waters. Escort groups no longer reacted passively, but hunted aggressively, turning on U-boats with coordinated maneuvers. Support groups, formed of warships detached from convoys, roamed the Atlantic specifically to hunt submarines, seeking them out before they could mass against merchantmen. These groups employed intelligence from Bletchley Park's ultra-decrypts, directing escorts toward patrol lines with deadly precision. Aircraft worked in tandem with surface ships, forcing submarines to surface with bombing runs before warships closed in. The synergy of intelligence, technology, and aggression created a new battlefield dynamic in which the Wolfpacks were increasingly overwhelmed. For the first time, U-boats faced opponents who anticipated their moves and responded with devastating efficiency. Convoys became traps as often as they were targets, ensnaring submarines in webs of coordinated defense. The tactical shift marked a fundamental change in the nature of the Atlantic War, turning the initiative from the hunters to the hunted. The results of these improvements were dramatic and measurable. In the early months of 1943, U-boats inflicted serious losses, sinking over 600,000 tons of shipping in March alone. Yet by May, the tide had turned decisively, with losses plummeting as U-boats fell victim to the reinforced defences. In that single month, Germany lost 41 submarines, nearly a quarter of its operational force, an unsustainable rate that shocked Admiral Dönitz and the entire Kriegsmarine. Convoys that once staggered into port, half destroyed, now arrived largely intact, their escorts victorious in battles that stretched across hundreds of miles of ocean. The strategic balance shifted as Britain's survival was assured, with supplies flowing steadily to support both its population and its armies abroad. The U-boat arm, once hailed as Germany's most effective weapon, now bled crews and vessels at a rate it could not replace. The Allies had wrested control of the Atlantic, not completely, but enough to ensure the Lifeline endured. The battle's climax had come, and Germany's dream of starving Britain into submission had collapsed under the weight of Allied superiority. The turning of the tide in 1942-43 was not merely a military triumph, but a testament to human resilience and ingenuity. It demonstrated how adversity could be transformed into strength through adaptation, cooperation, and innovation. The Allies had faced the brink of disaster, yet instead of breaking, they rallied, pooling their resources across nations and disciplines. Scientists, sailors, pilots, and shipbuilders each contributed pieces of the solution, forging a collective effort greater than the sum of its parts. The U-boats had enjoyed their happy times, but those days were over, buried beneath the weight of Allied progress. For the sailors who endured the darkest nights of the Atlantic, the change was palpable. Fear gave way to cautious confidence, despair to determination. The Atlantic lifeline, once so fragile, was now secure enough to carry the supplies that would fuel victory in Europe. The story of 1942-43 was the story of survival turned into supremacy. It was proof that in war, the tide could be turned not by chance, but by the relentless will to adapt and endure. In the summer of 1942, the Arctic Ocean became the setting for one of the most tragic episodes in the Battle of the Atlantic, the disaster of Convoy PQ-17. These Arctic convoys were lifelines linking the Western Allies to the Soviet Union, carrying tanks, aircraft, ammunition, and raw materials vital to the Eastern Front. The route was among the most dangerous of the war, threading through icy waters where German aircraft, U-boats, and surface raiders lay in wait. Convoy PQ-17, consisting of 35 merchant ships escorted by warships, departed Iceland on June 27th under constant threat. The midnight sun of the Arctic summer provided little cover, exposing the convoy to relentless aerial reconnaissance. Every mile brought new hazards, treacherous ice floes, freezing seas, and the looming spectre of German surface forces. At the heart of the fear was the battleship Tirpitz, whose mere presence in Norway tied Allied nerves in knots. The fate of PQ-17 would become a lesson in both the perils of miscommunication and the unforgiving nature of Arctic warfare. What began as a mission of solidarity to aid the Soviets ended as catastrophe. The convoy initially sailed under heavy escort, including destroyers, corvettes, and even distant covering forces of cruisers and battleships. This protection reflected the importance of the mission, for Stalin had pressed the Allies to deliver supplies urgently as Soviet forces reeled under the German advance. Yet the threat posed by the Tirpitz overshadowed all planning. Intelligence reports, some exaggerated, suggested that the mighty battleship, along with heavy cruisers, was preparing to sortie against PQ-17. The British Admiralty, haunted by the possibility of losing capital ships in a surface battle, faced a terrible dilemma. On July 4th, believing the Tirpitz to be at sea, the Admiralty issued the fateful order, "Convoy is to scatter." Merchant ships, stripped of their escorts, were told to sail independently for Soviet ports. The decision left defenseless freighters spread across the Arctic, easy prey for the Luftwaffe and U-boats. It was a catastrophic blunder, born of fear rather than certainty. The order to scatter transformed a dangerous mission into a death sentence for many of the convoy's ships. The consequences were immediate and devastating. Once dispersed, the merchant ships lost the protection of escorts, becoming isolated targets scattered across hundreds of miles. German aircraft swooped in from bases in Norway, launching torpedo and bombing runs that tore through the unprotected vessels. U-boats, already shadowing the convoy, attacked at will, sinking ships with little opposition. Flames lit the icy waters as ships loaded with ammunition and fuel exploded, sending plumes of smoke into the Arctic sky. Sailors leapt into freezing seas, where survival time was measured in minutes. Rescue was rare, as escorts had been pulled away to avoid engagement with the Tirpitz. The horror of PQ-17 lay not just in the sinkings, but in the helplessness of those aboard, abandoned to their fate by a decision made far away in London. Out of the 35 merchant ships that set out, 24 were lost. The shattered convoy marked one of the worst defeats in the history of Allied shipping. Its survivors carried memories of chaos, fear, and betrayal. The Tirpitz, in reality, never fired a shot at PQ-17. Though she left her anchorage briefly, German Naval Command hesitated to risk the battleship against overwhelming Allied covering forces. The fear of losing their prized vessel kept the Kriegsmarine cautious, but by then the damage had been done. The mere threat of the Tirpitz had been enough to paralyze Allied planning and cause catastrophic losses. It was a reminder of the power of psychological warfare at sea. One ship could immobilize fleets without firing its guns. For the Germans, the sinking of PQ-17's ships was a propaganda triumph, paraded as proof of their naval dominance. For the Allies, it was a humiliation that strained relations with the Soviet Union, which demanded better protection for future convoys. The disaster showed how fragile Allied cooperation could be, and how fear-driven decisions could prove more costly than direct combat. The Tirpitz became a phantom adversary, shaping the Atlantic War as much with its presence as with its actions. The lessons of PQ-17 reverberated throughout Allied strategy. Never again would a convoy be ordered to scatter in the face of surface threats. The disaster underscored the principle that convoys were strongest when they remained united under escort, even against formidable odds. In the months that followed, convoy defenses were strengthened with heavier escorts and better coordination between air and naval forces. The Arctic convoys continued, carrying vital aid to the Soviets, but with greater caution and resilience. PQ-18, the next major convoy, sailed with improved air cover and escort carriers, showing that lessons had been learned. The price paid for these lessons, however, was steep. Thousands of tons of war material lost, and hundreds of sailors dead in icy graves. For the men who survived, PQ-17 remained a bitter memory of abandonment and sacrifice. It became a byword for failure, cited as a case study in the dangers of overreaction. Out of tragedy came reform, but the scars of the convoy would never fully heal. The human dimension of PQ-17 was one of unimaginable suffering. Survivors described drifting in lifeboats surrounded by burning oil, their hands frozen to the oars, their breath shallow in the Arctic chill. Some watched comrades slip beneath the waves, unable to hold on against the cold. Rescue, when it came, was often too late, as men succumbed to hypothermia before reaching safety. Those who survived carried lifelong scars, physical and emotional, from the ordeal. Families back home received sparse details, left to imagine the terror their loved ones endured. For Soviet allies, the loss of desperately needed supplies was a blow to their war effort, though they pressed on regardless. The tragedy revealed the human cost of strategic miscalculation, where decisions made in distant offices sealed the fate of men far away. PQ-17 was not just a naval disaster, it was a human catastrophe. Each ship lost carried not only cargo but lives, stories, and hopes extinguished in the icy waters. In the broader context of the Battle of the Atlantic, PQ-17 stood as a sobering reminder that victory required more than strength. It required judgment, coordination, and trust. The Arctic convoys continued, and over time they proved invaluable in sustaining the Soviet war effort, helping to tip the balance on the Eastern Front. Yet the shadow of PQ-17 lingered, shaping Allied caution and Soviet skepticism alike. The disaster highlighted the need for unity in command and discipline in execution, lessons that influenced subsequent operations across the Atlantic. For Churchill and his commanders, it was a bitter pill, a reminder that even the strongest fleets could falter under poor decisions. For the men who endured it, PQ-17 became etched into memory as both tragedy and warning. Its story endures as part of the greater narrative of the Atlantic struggle, a tale of courage, error, and costly redemption. In the icebound seas of the Arctic, the Battle of the Atlantic revealed its harshest truths. PQ-17 was a disaster, but its lessons helped shape eventual victory. By 1943, the central drama of the Battle of the Atlantic was playing out in the deadly duels between German Wolfpacks and Allied convoys. The Wolfpack tactic, masterminded by Admiral Karl Donitz, relied on groups of U-boats shadowing convoys and then converging to overwhelm their defenses. It was a concept born of scarcity. No single U-boat could destroy an entire convoy, but dozens, coordinated by radio, could rip through even the most heavily guarded formations. Early successes had made Wolfpacks legendary, feared by sailors who knew the odds were against them once submarines massed. Yet the Allies had grown wiser and stronger, refining their tactics, technology, and coordination to resist these assaults. Convoys now traveled with more escorts, aircraft cover, and access to ultra-intelligence, making Wolfpack operations increasingly dangerous. The resulting clashes were fierce, sprawling battles fought over days and nights across thousands of square miles of ocean. Nowhere was this more evident than in March 1943, during the convoy battles of HX 229 and SC 122. These encounters revealed both the power and the limits of Wolfpack warfare. They became the defining struggle of the Atlantic War, a test of endurance between predator and prey. Convoy HX 229 sailed from New York on March 8, 1943, bound for Liverpool with over 40 merchant ships carrying vital cargo. At the same time, Convoy SC 122 departed Halifax, Canada, on a parallel route with similar numbers. Both were targeted by U-boat patrol lines waiting in the mid-Atlantic, guided by radio intercepts and coordinated through German headquarters. Donitz deployed more than 40 U-boats in overlapping patrols, creating a vast net across the ocean. As the convoys entered the danger zone, U-boat lookouts spotted them and began transmitting shadowing reports. Soon, dozens of submarines converged, striking under cover of night in coordinated attacks. The escorts fought desperately, but they were outnumbered, chasing one contact only to see another submarine slip through and launch torpedoes. Explosions rocked the darkness as tankers and freighters went up in flames, their crews leaping into lifeboats amidst burning oil. For days the battles raged, with U-boats pressing relentlessly against exhausted escorts. The twin convoys became the focus of the largest convoy battle of the entire Atlantic campaign. The scale of destruction inflicted upon HX 229 and SC 122 was staggering. Over the course of a single week, 21 merchant ships were sunk, representing nearly 150,000 tons of cargo. Tankers carrying fuel, freighters loaded with grain, and ships bearing munitions all went to the bottom. The U-boat commanders exulted, sending triumphant messages back to headquarters. For the sailors of the merchant fleet, it was a nightmare of chaos, fire, and death. Survivors spoke of entire convoys shattered, of ships exploding beside them, and of nights illuminated by burning wreckage. Escorts worked tirelessly, depth charges booming across the ocean, but the Wolfpacks always seemed to return with renewed strength. Each ship lost meant more lives consigned to the icy waters, where survival times were short and rescue uncertain. The Germans believed they had struck a decisive blow, one that would force Britain back toward the brink of collapse. In those grim days of March 1943, the Battle of the Atlantic seemed poised to tip once again in Germany's favor. The Wolfpacks had shown their teeth, and the results were devastating. Yet, even in the midst of destruction, signs of change were visible. The escorts of HX 229 and SC 122, though heavily pressed, inflicted damage on the attackers. Several U-boats were damaged or destroyed, victims of depth charges and relentless pursuit. Aircraft, flying long-range patrols from bases in Greenland and Iceland, began to harass the Wolfpacks, forcing them to dive and disrupting their attacks. Ultra-intelligence provided clues about the positioning of U-boats, enabling some convoys to evade the worst of the assaults. For the first time, the German Wolfpacks were encountering defenses that could match their aggression. The victories of March 1943 were costly, achieved at the price of mounting U-boat casualties. Donitz's commanders reported growing fatigue and frustration as the Allies adapted, using radar and sonar to strip away the U-boat's invisibility. Even as HX 229 and SC 122 suffered, the seeds of Allied recovery were taking root. The Wolfpack tactic, once unstoppable, was beginning to face the reality of diminishing returns. The balance of power was shifting beneath the surface of the Atlantic. The convoy battles of March 1943 marked both the high point and the beginning of the end for German Wolfpack strategy. Though the U-boats inflicted enormous losses, their own casualties were rising unsustainably. Escorts had grown more aggressive, no longer content to merely defend but actively hunting submarines. Hedgehog mortars and improved depth charges increased kill rates, while radar-equipped aircraft prowled the skies above. The Germans had relied on radio coordination to mass their Wolfpacks, but Allied HF/DF stations intercepted these signals, allowing escorts to anticipate attacks. Donitz's carefully orchestrated strikes were increasingly disrupted, his boats ambushed before they could deliver their blows. The happy times of unchallenged hunting were gone, replaced by a deadly contest in which every attack carried higher risk. The Wolfpack strategy had reached its apex in March, but with it came the recognition that the tide was about to turn. The very battles that showcased their power also revealed their fragility. The human toll of these battles was immense, borne most heavily by the sailors of the merchant fleet. Each crossing became a test of endurance, with crews knowing that torpedoes could strike at any moment. Survivors described the horror of seeing comrades killed instantly, of nights spent huddled in lifeboats, and of watching entire convoys torn apart. Escorts, too, endured constant pressure, their crews fighting exhaustion as they hunted submarines hour after hour. On the German side, U-boat crews faced increasingly dangerous missions, their confidence shaken by mounting losses. Many submariners perished in the icy Atlantic, their vessels crushed under the sea after desperate battles. The clash of Wolfpacks and convoys was not only a military contest, but a human tragedy, claiming lives on both sides in staggering numbers. The Atlantic War was fought in steel and explosives, but its true cost was measured in lives lost to the sea. The convoy battles of 1943 became enduring symbols of this sacrifice. In retrospect, the battles of HX 229 and SC 122 represented a turning point in the Battle of the Atlantic. They demonstrated both the potential and the limits of Wolfpack warfare, highlighting how close Britain came to disaster, but also how resilience and innovation could avert defeat. After March 1943, the Allies rapidly strengthened their defences, deploying more escort carriers, long-range aircraft, and support groups to hunt U-boats. Convoy losses declined sharply, while U-boat casualties mounted to catastrophic levels. Dönitz, once confident of victory, soon faced the collapse of his submarine arm under the weight of Allied superiority. The Wolfpack, once feared as the ultimate predator, was revealed to be vulnerable when confronted by coordinated, technologically advanced defenses. For the Allies, the survival of HX 229 and SC 122, despite heavy losses, was proof that endurance could triumph over terror. For Germany, it was the beginning of decline, the moment when the hunters began to be hunted. The great battles of March 1943 thus stand as both climax and turning point in the longest struggle of the Second World War. While Britain and the United States often dominate the narrative of the Battle of the Atlantic, it was Canada that shouldered an extraordinary burden in keeping the Lifeline open. At the outbreak of war in 1939, Canada's navy was tiny, consisting of just a handful of destroyers and aging vessels. Yet by the end of the conflict, the Royal Canadian Navy had grown into the third largest naval force in the world, with hundreds of ships and tens of thousands of sailors. From the frigid waters of the North Atlantic, Canadian escorts became the backbone of convoy protection, braving storms and U-boats alike. Their corvettes, small but resilient, escorted merchantmen across the most dangerous stretches of ocean. Out of necessity, Canadian sailors learned quickly, often through painful experience, refining their tactics against Wolfpacks. Newfoundland, strategically positioned as a staging point, became a hub of Allied operations, with convoys gathering at St. John's before crossing into the Atlantic. Canada's role was not merely supportive, it was central, a testament to how a young nation rose to meet a global crisis. The Battle of the Atlantic cannot be told without the story of Canada's transformation from naval minor to indispensable ally. The corvette became the workhorse of the Canadian Navy. A small, lightly armed escort ship, originally designed for coastal patrols, but adapted for ocean duty. These vessels were far from glamorous, with cramped quarters, poor seaworthiness in heavy seas, and limited firepower. Yet they were fast to build, sturdy, and vital in filling the escort gap that plagued Britain's overstretched navy. Crews on Canadian corvettes endured appalling conditions, violent storms, icy decks, and weeks of relentless patrols with little respite. Their sonar and depth charges provided the first line of defense against U-boats, and their mere presence gave merchant sailors reassurance. Over time, Canadian shipyards churned out improved classes of escorts, including frigates, with better range and comfort. Training schools in Halifax and elsewhere prepared new generations of sailors who took to the Atlantic with growing confidence. The corvette may have been modest, but in the hands of Canadian crews, it became a symbol of resilience. Night after night, they faced the terror of Wolfpacks with determination. These small ships and their determined crews played an outsized role in keeping Britain alive. Newfoundland played an equally critical role as a forward base of operations, bridging the gap between North America and Europe. From St. John Surts, Argentia and other ports, convoys assembled before venturing into the U-boat-infested Atlantic. The island became a hive of activity, with docks crowded by merchantmen, escorts, and supply vessels. Airfields provided bases for patrol aircraft that extended the range of protection, though the Black Pit still loomed beyond their reach in the early years. Newfoundland's geographic position made it a linchpin in the Allied effort, a staging ground where the convoy system could gather strength before plunging into danger. Local communities bore the weight of war, their towns transformed into bustling centers of naval logistics. Sailors from across the world passed through, leaving stories and friendships in their wake. For Canada and Newfoundland, the war turned the North Atlantic into their front line, fought not in distant lands but in their own backyard. The sacrifices made here were critical in sustaining the fight across the ocean. International cooperation defined the Allied effort, with smaller nations contributing ships, crews, and determination despite their limited resources. Norway, whose homeland was under German occupation, maintained an active navy in exile that escorted convoys and hunted U-boats alongside the Royal Navy. The Dutch Navy, similarly displaced, contributed destroyers and submarines, bringing valuable experience from years of maritime tradition. Poland, though conquered early in the war, fielded naval units that continued to fight from British bases, their sailors determined to strike back against Germany. Each of these contributions, while modest in numbers compared to the fleets of Britain and the United States, carried immense symbolic and practical value. They embodied the principle that the Battle of the Atlantic was not a struggle of 2 or 3 nations alone, but a global effort. Flags of many countries flew in the stormy Atlantic, united against the common threat of the U-boats. Their presence boosted morale and strengthened the bonds of alliance. The war at sea became a coalition effort in every sense, proving that survival depended on shared sacrifice. The coordination of this multinational fleet was no small achievement. Convoys were complex organisms, requiring ships of different nationalities, languages, and capabilities to operate in harmony. Commanders had to balance varied equipment, training standards, and doctrines while ensuring that every ship worked toward the same goal. This demanded an unprecedented level of communication and discipline, achieved through relentless drills and shared doctrine. Canadian commanders played a central role in this integration, bridging the gap between British experience and American resources. Joint operations became increasingly effective, with ships from different nations learning to anticipate one another's moves. The result was a formidable defensive system, capable of withstanding the concentrated assaults of Wolfpacks. The multinational nature of the convoys symbolized the unity of the Allied cause, each ship a fragment of a larger whole. It was not simply the Royal Navy or the US Navy that fought the Atlantic War. It was a coalition forged in the crucible of necessity. This cooperation foreshadowed the alliance that would win the war on land and in the air as well. Beyond navies, Allied air forces also reflected the diversity of nations committed to the Atlantic struggle. Canadian squadrons of the Royal Canadian Air Force flew patrols from bases along the Atlantic coast, scouring the seas for periscopes and oil slicks. Norwegian airmen flew with distinction in coastal command, their knowledge of northern waters proving invaluable. Polish pilots, displaced from their homeland, fought with tenacity, bringing both skill and a deep sense of purpose to the skies over the Atlantic. American patrol squadrons expanded steadily after 1941, operating from Greenland, Newfoundland, and Iceland to cover convoys across the mid-Atlantic gap. These aircrews endured long, monotonous flights, punctuated by sudden violence, dropping depth charges on U-boats caught on the surface. Their combined efforts further eroded the U-boat's dominance, knitting the air and sea campaigns into a seamless web of protection. Each nation's contribution, however small, added to the pressure that gradually overwhelmed the Wolfpacks. The skies over the Atlantic became as international as the waters beneath. By the end of the war, the role of Canada and other smaller allies had become an indelible part of the Atlantic story. Canada's navy, once negligible, had grown into a powerful force that escorted thousands of ships and played a decisive role in victory. Newfoundland's ports had served as lifelines, enabling the convoy system to function at full strength. The contributions of Norway, the Netherlands, Poland, and others reflected the spirit of unity that defined the Allied cause, showing that even nations under occupation could still strike blows against tyranny. The Battle of the Atlantic was not won by any single country, but by the combined will of many, each adding strength to the chain that linked America to Europe and sustained the fight against Nazi Germany. For Canada, the war forged a new identity, elevating it onto the world stage as a maritime power. For smaller allies, it preserved their honor and gave their exiled forces purpose. Together they proved that victory at sea was a collective achievement. The Atlantic War was, above all, a testament to cooperation. The Battle of the Atlantic was not only a contest of courage and endurance, but also a laboratory of technological innovation. From the moment German U-boats began their deadly hunt, the Allies sought tools that could strip away the submarine's greatest weapon, invisibility. The vastness of the ocean had long concealed the hunters beneath the waves, but science and engineering steadily eroded this advantage. Each year of the war brought new inventions, each designed to tilt the balance in favor of the convoys. Radar extended vision beyond human sight, sonar probed beneath the surface, and new weapons allowed escorts to strike with greater precision. The arrival of escort carriers brought aircraft into the heart of the convoys, denying submarines the freedom of the open sea. The cumulative effect of these breakthroughs was transformative, reshaping the battle from a desperate struggle into a fight the Allies could win. For sailors and airmen, technology became both shield and sword, tools that allowed them to fight back against the predators of the deep. The Atlantic, once dominated by stealth, became a battlefield where science exposed the shadows. One of the earliest and most decisive innovations was HF/DF, known colloquially as HFDUF, short for high-frequency direction finding. This technology allowed Allied ships to detect and triangulate the radio transmissions of U-boats, which relied on constant communication to coordinate Wolfpack attacks. Each time a submarine reported its position or received orders from headquarters, it risked betraying itself to the Allies. HF/DF stations on land and aboard escort ships intercepted these signals, calculating bearings and pointing commanders toward enemy locations. What once gave the Germans coordination now exposed them to ambushes. Convoys could adjust course to avoid patrol lines, or escorts could hunt submarines even before they attacked. HFDUF turned the U-boat's strength, teamwork through radio, into a vulnerability. For sailors who had once felt blind in the Atlantic darkness, it was a revelation, a compass pointing toward the hidden enemy. Though invisible beneath the waves, the submarines could not hide from their own voices. HF/DF was the beginning of intelligence-driven naval warfare, a quiet revolution that shaped every battle that followed. Radar, too, revolutionized the struggle, extending Allied eyes into realms once cloaked in darkness. Early radar sets were crude, bulky, and prone to interference, but as the war progressed, they became increasingly reliable and compact. Mounted on ships and aircraft, radar allowed escorts to detect U-boats on the surface, even at night or in heavy fog. Submarine commanders had long used darkness as cover, surfacing to recharge batteries and communicate under the cloak of night. Radar stripped away this advantage, catching U-boats unawares and forcing them to dive before they could launch attacks. Aircraft equipped with radar could patrol vast stretches of ocean, detecting periscopes or conning towers from miles away. The once invisible predators now found themselves under constant surveillance, robbed of the freedom they once enjoyed. For sailors, radar became a trusted guardian, a tool that turned the blackness of the Atlantic into a battlefield they could navigate with confidence. For submariners, it was a new source of fear, a reminder that the enemy could see through the night. Radar was not just a machine, it was a weapon of certainty. Beneath the waves, sonar, known at the time as ASDIC, gave escorts the ability to probe the ocean's depths. Developed before the war, but refined under fire, ASDIC emitted sound pulses that bounced off submerged objects, revealing the presence of submarines. Escorts no longer relied solely on luck or chance sightings. They could track U-boats even after they dove. The system was not perfect, often losing contact during attacks, but it gave escorts a new dimension of power. Paired with disciplined tactics, sonar transformed escorts from passive guardians into active hunters. Convoys could now move with greater confidence, knowing their escorts had the tools to strike back. U-boat commanders, once secure beneath the surface, now found the depths far less safe. Every ping of sonar was a reminder that the enemy was listening, probing, and closing in. ASDIC turned the ocean into contested ground, where hiding was no longer a guarantee of survival. It was the sound of progress, echoing through the deep, heralding the end of the U-boat's supremacy. New weapons emerged alongside these detection technologies, providing escorts with lethal tools to match their newfound awareness. The most significant was the Hedgehog mortar, a forward-firing array of explosives that allowed ships to attack submarines without losing sonar contact. Unlike depth charges, which exploded at set depths and often forced escorts to pass over their targets, the Hedgehog launched dozens of small charges ahead of the ship. These exploded only upon impact with a submarine's hull, making them deadly precise and conserving ammunition. Escorts could now attack continuously, hammering U-boats with waves of explosives until they broke apart beneath the waves. The Hedgehog changed the psychology of the hunt, giving escorts an aggressive tool that placed submarines constantly on the defensive. Depth charges, too, improved, with variable fuses that allowed commanders to set explosions at exact depths. Together, these weapons transformed convoy escorts from fragile guardians into predators in their own right. Submariners faced not only the terror of being found, but the certainty of being destroyed. The balance of power beneath the waves shifted decisively. Above the convoys, aircraft and escort carriers multiplied the effectiveness of these innovations. Escort carriers, smaller than fleet carriers but purpose-built for convoy defense, brought squadrons of patrol planes into the heart of the Atlantic. No longer limited to coastal waters, aircraft now soared over the mid-ocean gap, spotting submarines and attacking with depth charges or rockets. The Lee Light, a powerful searchlight mounted on patrol aircraft, further stripped U-boats of their nocturnal safety. At night, radar would guide aircraft to their targets, and the sudden blaze of the Lee Light illuminated submarines caught on the surface. Seconds later, Bombs and depth charges followed, leaving U-boats little chance of survival. The combination of radar, lee lights, and aircraft transformed the night from a safe haven into a death trap for submariners. Pilots, once peripheral to the Atlantic struggle, became central players in the battle. Their presence ensured that the U-boat Menace was contested from above as well as below. The Atlantic War was now three-dimensional, fought on the surface, in the skies, and in the depths. The cumulative effect of these technological breakthroughs was transformative, turning the Battle of the Atlantic from a defensive struggle into an offensive campaign against the U-boats. No longer could submarines operate with impunity. Each patrol became a gamble against radar, sonar, HF/DF, hedgehogs, and aircraft. The Wolfpack tactic, once Germany's deadliest weapon, faltered under the relentless pressure of these advances. By mid-1943, U-boat losses mounted catastrophically, forcing Donitz to withdraw many submarines from the Atlantic. For the Allies, the integration of technology with tactics and intelligence marked the true turning point of the campaign. It was not one machine or one invention, but the sum of many, applied with discipline and ingenuity, that broke the U-boat's grip on the Atlantic. The battle was no longer about sheer numbers, but about mastery of science in service of survival. In this struggle, the Allies proved that technology, when harnessed with courage and cooperation, could change the course of war. The Atlantic was no longer a graveyard of hope. It was becoming a highway to victory. By the spring of 1943, the Battle of the Atlantic reached a dramatic turning point that historians now call the U-boat crisis. For nearly 4 years, Admiral Karl Donitz's submarines had terrorized Allied shipping, threatening Britain's survival and the success of the wider war. But as winter turned to spring, the hunters became the hunted. The introduction of new technologies, long-range aircraft, improved radar, HF/DF, and weapons like the Hedgehog, stripped away the U-boat's invisibility. Convoy escorts grew in number and skill, supported by escort carriers that brought air cover into the heart of the Atlantic. What had once been the U-boat's hunting ground became a killing field for their crews. Between April and May, the scale of losses reached catastrophic levels. Dozens of U-boats were destroyed each month, their crews sent to watery graves with little chance of survival. The German dream of starving Britain into submission collapsed in just a few short weeks. 1943 was the year the tide truly turned. The crisis began with a series of disastrous encounters for the U-boats, as Wolfpacks clashed with convoys under increasingly unfavorable conditions. Convoys like ONS-5 in May 1943 showed how dramatically the balance had shifted. Once vulnerable, ONS-5's escorts, armed with radar and reinforced by aircraft, destroyed 6 U-boats in a single engagement while delivering most of its merchantmen safely. Other convoys repeated this pattern, with escorts taking the offensive and battering Wolfpacks before they could mount sustained attacks. The German strategy of concentrating dozens of submarines now backfired, as large groups became easier for Allied intelligence and aircraft to detect. Instead of overwhelming defenses, the Wolfpacks stumbled into coordinated counterattacks that cost them dearly. Convoys that once limped into port half destroyed now sailed with confidence, while German crews described the ocean as a death trap. In the space of weeks, the myth of U-boat dominance evaporated. The Atlantic, once their domain, turned hostile. The statistics of 1943 tell the story of collapse in stark detail. In May alone, 41 U-boats were sunk, nearly a quarter of Germany's operational fleet at the time. Over the course of that year, nearly 240 submarines were lost, a rate far higher than Germany could replace. With each loss, hundreds of trained crewmen perished, taking with them hard-won experience that could not be rebuilt quickly. The average U-boat crew's life expectancy shrank to a matter of weeks, and the once proud service became a graveyard for Germany's youth. For Dönitz, who had staked his career and reputation on the submarine arm, the crisis was a personal as well as professional catastrophe. Despite desperate pleas for more resources, Hitler prioritized other fronts, leaving the U-boat fleet to wither. The numerical and psychological toll broke the back of Germany's submarine campaign. The Atlantic Lifeline, once under mortal threat, was now secure enough to guarantee the flow of men, weapons, and supplies that would enable the Allied invasions of Europe. Hitler's response to the crisis revealed both his desperation and his stubborn refusal to accept reality. Furious at the losses, he demanded new measures, calling for technological miracles and renewed offensives. Dönitz promised that advanced designs like the snorkel-equipped Type XX Orne electroboats would restore the fleet's power, but these innovations came too late and in too few numbers. In the meantime, Hitler urged his commanders to redouble their efforts, ignoring the fact that the tactical situation had fundamentally changed. U-boat crews were ordered to continue their patrols despite overwhelming Allied superiority, a demand that condemned many to certain death. The Führer's obsession with maintaining pressure on the Atlantic front reflected his unwillingness to concede any ground, even when strategy dictated withdrawal. For the sailors of the Kriegsmarine, this meant relentless missions with little hope of success and every expectation of loss. The U-boat fleet, once hailed as Germany's best weapon, became a tool of attrition, sacrificed for diminishing returns. The crisis of 1943 also reflected the cumulative advantage of Allied industry and organization. American shipyards were launching Liberty ships faster than U-boats could sink them, replacing lost tonnage within weeks. Escort groups expanded, with destroyers and frigates flooding into the Atlantic from both sides of the ocean. Aircraft production soared, bringing long-range patrol planes into service in unprecedented numbers. Technology advanced, not incrementally, but exponentially, ensuring that each month brought new tools to the fight. Against this avalanche of resources, the German submarine fleet stood little chance. Dönitz had once hoped that a small number of highly trained crews could outmatch the Allies, but by 1943, the imbalance of production was overwhelming. The Atlantic had become a numbers game, and in that game, the Allies could not lose. Every destroyed U-boat widened the gap further, while every saved convoy carried the supplies that built the armies preparing for D-Day. The submarine war, once Germany's best hope, became a slow-motion disaster. For U-boat crews, the crisis was felt in the rawest human terms. Missions grew longer, more perilous, and increasingly futile. Submariners described living under constant fear, listening for the whine of depth charges or the buzz of patrol aircraft engines. Sleep was scarce, morale plummeted, and survival seemed a matter of chance rather than skill. Some crews were lost without trace, swallowed by the ocean, with no survivors to tell their story. Letters home grew darker, filled with resignation and despair. The once proud service, romanticized in German propaganda as the cutting edge of naval warfare, became synonymous with death. The bravery of the crews was undeniable, but their sacrifice served little strategic purpose by 1943. They fought and died in a campaign already decided by Allied superiority. The human cost of the U-boat crisis was immense, measured not only in lives lost, but in wasted potential. Thousands of Germany's best young men perished in the Atlantic for a cause that had already slipped away. By the end of 1943, the crisis had reshaped the Atlantic War permanently. The Wolfpack tactic, once the terror of the seas, was effectively broken. Convoys now sailed with growing confidence, their survival rate soaring as U-boat losses mounted. The Atlantic Lifeline, once fragile, became secure enough to sustain the full weight of Allied offensives in Europe and North Africa. For Germany, the U-boat fleet lingered on, but only as a shadow of its former self, unable to mount decisive challenges. Hitler's dream of strangling Britain through starvation was finished, buried beneath the wreckage of his submarines. For the Allies, the U-boat crisis of 1943 was the moment when endurance became dominance, when technology, production, and cooperation combined to achieve victory. The Atlantic, once a graveyard of hope, was transformed into a highway of war supplies. The struggle had been long and brutal, but by 1943, the outcome was no longer in doubt. The U-boat arm had met its breaking point and never recovered. By 1944, the U-boat fleet, once Germany's most feared weapon, had been battered into near irrelevance. The crisis of 1943 had destroyed hundreds of submarines, leaving the survivors cautious, worn down, and increasingly ineffective. Yet Adolf Hitler and Admiral Karl Dönitz refused to abandon the campaign, clinging to the belief that new technology could reverse the tide. Germany invested heavily in advanced submarine designs, introducing the snorkel to allow U-boats to remain submerged while running diesel engines, and promising revolutionary electroboats in the form of the Type. These developments aimed to restore stealth and survivability, negating Allied radar and aircraft patrols. But while the designs were impressive on paper, the reality of late-war Germany, bombed factories, fuel shortages, and exhausted crews, meant that few of these innovations reached the battlefield in time. Meanwhile, the Allies had achieved overwhelming naval and air dominance. The endgame of the Atlantic War was not a dramatic resurgence of German power, but a slow, grinding collapse. The U-boats, once predators, now crept cautiously, hunted at every turn. The snorkel, first deployed in 1944, was meant to give U-boats a new lease on life by allowing them to remain submerged for longer periods. By channeling air into the submarine while running diesel engines just below the surface, the snorkel reduced the need to surface, a moment when radar-equipped aircraft often caught submarines unawares. In practice, however, the device was clumsy, prone to mechanical failure, and limited the crew's ability to operate effectively. Submariners endured suffocating conditions, as the snorkel often drew in exhaust fumes, leaving them nauseous and weakened. Worse still, Allied radar quickly adapted, detecting the small mast protruding from the waves. The snorkel delayed the inevitable, but it did not reverse the strategic balance. Crews began to realize that even with this innovation, their odds of surviving a patrol were slim. What had been sold as salvation became just another grim tool of endurance in a war already lost. The snorkel represented the desperation of a navy fighting against time, technology, and overwhelming opposition. Far more ambitious was the Type XX-1 electroboat, a submarine designed to revolutionize undersea warfare. Unlike earlier models, the Type XX-1 could remain submerged for extended periods, powered by massive battery reserves, and could travel at speeds that outpaced many escort ships. Its streamlined hull and advanced systems promised to make it the first true submarine, rather than a submersible boat dependent on surfacing. In theory, it could have restored German dominance by evading Allied patrols and striking convoys with impunity. Yet production delays, sabotage by forced laborers in German factories, and the collapse of Germany's industrial infrastructure meant that only a handful were completed. Fewer still saw combat, entering the war too late to influence its outcome. The Type XX-1 was a glimpse of the future, foreshadowing the submarine designs of the Cold War, but it was a weapon of potential rather than impact. For Dönitz and his commanders, it was a bitter realization. The innovation that could have saved them had arrived too late. The Type XX-1 became a symbol of squandered opportunity, overshadowed by the weight of defeat. Even as these innovations emerged, the Allies pressed their advantage with overwhelming force. Escort carriers, long-range patrol aircraft, and hunter-killer groups scoured the Atlantic with ruthless efficiency. Radar and sonar were refined further, making it nearly impossible for submarines to move undetected. Ultra-intelligence continued to read German communications, ensuring that Wolfpack formations were intercepted before they could form. Liberty ships and tankers poured out of American shipyards faster than U-boats could sink them, flooding the Atlantic with an unstoppable tide of supplies. By 1944, the lifeline to Britain and the invasion of France was secure. The D-Day landings in June 1944, a massive amphibious operation requiring unprecedented logistical support, proceeded without major U-boat disruption. Germany's submarines, once the terror of the seas, had been reduced to a nuisance, their attacks sporadic and often suicidal. The Allied machine had simply grown too large, too efficient, and too relentless to be stopped. The Atlantic had been conquered not only by courage, but by industrial supremacy. The final missions of the U-boat fleet were marked by futility and tragedy. Crews continued to sail from occupied ports in France and Norway, knowing full well the odds were stacked against them. Many submarines never returned, lost without trace in the vastness of the ocean. Others limped home damaged, their commanders reporting that they had barely seen convoys before being forced to dive or retreat. Morale collapsed as losses mounted. Young crews, poorly trained and inexperienced, replaced veterans lost in the earlier years of the war. For many, the U-boat service had become a death sentence. The once proud submarine arm that had inflicted terror on Britain's supply lines was now sacrificed in a hopeless struggle. By the war's end, over 70% of U-boat crews had perished, a death rate unmatched in any other branch of the German military. Each mission became a grim lottery, a roll of the dice in a game already decided. The U-boat fleet had become a ghost of its former self. Germany's naval defeat was not only a matter of lost ships, but of shattered strategy. Hitler had placed immense faith in the U-boats to strangle Britain and shift the war in Germany's favor. Yet by 1944, this hope was long extinguished. Dönitz continued to insist that submarines could still influence the war, but his pleas fell on deaf ears. The reality was that Germany's naval resources were too limited, its industry too crippled, and its enemies too powerful. The once feared Wolfpacks had disintegrated, unable to mount serious challenges against Allied convoys. The Atlantic, once contested at every turn, was now firmly in Allied hands. Germany's defeat at sea was sealed, a precondition for the liberation of Europe. Without control of the Atlantic, Hitler could not prevent the Allied build-up that stormed Normandy and pressed into the Reich itself. The collapse of the U-boat campaign symbolized the collapse of Germany's wider ambitions. The sea, once an avenue of hope, had become a graveyard of strategy. By May 1945, as the Third Reich collapsed on land, the remnants of the U-boat fleet faced their final orders. Many surrendered in Allied ports, their crews disembarking to face captivity rather than certain death. Others scuttled their vessels, sending them to the bottom to avoid capture. The Atlantic was littered with wrecks, silent memorials to a campaign that had claimed tens of thousands of lives. The Allies had won not only through superior numbers, but through relentless innovation, coordination, and endurance. The U-boat arm, which once held the fate of nations in its periscope sights, had been annihilated. In the end, the war at sea mirrored the war on land. Germany had gambled on technological miracles and ruthless aggression, but the Allies' resources and cooperation proved decisive. The Battle of the Atlantic closed not with a dramatic final clash, but with the quiet surrender of exhausted crews. The Endgame of 1944-45 was the final chapter in a story of ambition undone by endurance. The hunters had become the hunted, and their war beneath the waves was over. The Battle of the Atlantic was the longest continuous campaign of the Second World War, stretching from 1939 to 1945, and its legacy remains etched into the history of global conflict. Its strategic significance cannot be overstated. Without victory in the Atlantic, Britain would have starved, the Soviet Union would have faltered without aid, and the Allied invasion of Europe would have been impossible. It was a war fought not for territory, but for survival, where every ship that reached port carried the promise of endurance. The convoys became arteries of life, linking continents and sustaining armies, while the U-boats threatened to sever them at every turn. Victory here ensured victory elsewhere, making the Atlantic campaign the silent foundation of all Allied operations. The lessons of this struggle shaped not only the outcome of the war, but the strategies of navies for generations to come. To understand the Second World War, one must first understand the Atlantic. Its waves carried the fate of nations. The cost of this victory was staggering, measured in lives, ships, and cargo lost to the sea. Over 3,500 merchant ships were sunk, along with more than 175 warships, claiming the lives of nearly 40,000 Allied sailors and merchant seamen. On the German side, over 750 U-boats were destroyed, with more than 28,000 submariners perishing, a death rate of nearly 75%, the highest of any branch of the German armed forces. Each sinking was a story of human tragedy, men leaping into burning seas, clinging to wreckage, or vanishing into the abyss with their vessels. The tonnage war was a brutal arithmetic of survival, where victory was measured not only in sunk ships, but in the ones that endured. Behind the statistics lay unimaginable suffering, endured in silence by sailors whose sacrifices rarely made headlines. The Atlantic was as much a graveyard as it was a highway, and its legacy is one of sorrow as well as triumph. For the Allied victory, the Atlantic campaign was nothing less than decisive. The secure flow of men, weapons, and food ensured that Britain could remain in the war after 1940, even when surrounded and battered by German advances. Supplies delivered across the ocean sustained the Soviet Union through Lend-Lease, providing tanks, trucks, and raw materials that fueled the Eastern Front. Most crucially, the success of D-Day in June 1944 was only possible because the Atlantic Lifeline had been secured the year before. The Great Armada that stormed Normandy was the culmination of years of struggle on the high seas, proof that control of the ocean meant control of the war. Germany's failure to win the Battle of the Atlantic doomed its chances of victory elsewhere. Without it, no amount of battlefield brilliance could have saved the Reich. The Atlantic was not just another front, it was the foundation of Allied success. The remembrance of sailors lost in the Atlantic forms a vital part of its legacy. Across Britain, Canada, the United States, and other Allied nations, memorials stand to honor the men who braved the convoys and never returned. Merchant seamen, often overlooked in traditional accounts of war, are now recognized for their courage and sacrifice. In Canada, Halifax became a symbol of endurance, its sailors remembered for guarding convoys through the darkest nights. In Britain, the Merchant Navy Memorial at Tower Hill lists the names of thousands who vanished beneath the waves. Germany, too, remembers its submariners, young men who fought with determination despite the futility of their mission. The ocean holds their remains, a vast cemetery stretching from the Arctic to the Caribbean. The legacy of the Battle of the Atlantic is not only military, but deeply human, rooted in remembrance and the stories of those who faced the sea and did not survive. Technological innovation was another enduring legacy of the campaign. The rapid development of radar, sonar, HF/DF, and anti-submarine weapons laid the foundation for modern naval warfare. The lessons learned in coordinating air, sea, and intelligence assets created the blueprint for integrated operations that continue to shape military doctrine today. The escort carrier, born of necessity, foreshadowed the central role of aviation in naval strategy. The Type XX-1 U-boat, though too late to change the war, influenced submarine design for decades, inspiring both NATO and Warsaw Pact navies during the Cold War. The Atlantic became a proving ground where science and strategy fused, accelerating technological progress at a pace unmatched in peacetime. This legacy ensured that the sacrifices of the campaign were not in vain, leaving behind tools and doctrines that safeguarded the seas in the conflicts that followed. Tactically, the Atlantic War taught hard lessons about the importance of coordination, flexibility, and resilience. The convoy system, once seen as cumbersome, proved to be the only effective defense against submarine predation. Escort groups, support units, and the integration of air power turned defense into offense, shifting the balance of initiative. The Allies learned to adapt quickly, refining their doctrines after every engagement, while the Germans failed to innovate beyond the Wolfpack strategy until it was too late. The lesson was clear: wars at sea are won not by a single weapon, but by the integration of many. This principle remains central to naval thinking today, where fleets rely on networks of ships, aircraft, and intelligence, rather than isolated vessels. The Battle of the Atlantic demonstrated that survival in modern war depends on cooperation across every domain. Its tactical legacy is still studied in naval academies worldwide. Ultimately, the Battle of the Atlantic left a legacy that transcends strategy and technology. It was a testament to endurance, cooperation, and the will to prevail under relentless pressure. It showed that victory could be forged not through swift battles alone, but through persistence across years of hardship. The campaign embodied the spirit of collective defense, uniting nations large and small in a common cause. Its memory reminds us of the fragility of lifelines in war, of the human cost hidden in statistics, and of the resilience that can emerge when survival is at stake. The sailors of the Atlantic, whether escort, merchant, or submariner, left behind a legacy of sacrifice that underpins the freedoms of today. The ocean they fought over remains vast and silent, but its waves carry echoes of their struggle. The Battle of the Atlantic was more than a campaign. It was the heartbeat of the Second World War, and its legacy endures as both warning and inspiration.